Welcome. Find yourself a comfortable position, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. Let the concerns of your day begin to settle like dust after a caravan has passed. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey, not through your own world, but through a landscape of sand and stone, of silk and spice, of extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary danger. We're traveling the Silk Road, not the romanticized version you might have encountered in history books with their colorful illustrations of laden camels and exotic markets. Tonight, we'll walk the actual routes, feel the actual sun, taste the actual dust. We'll understand why this network of trade routes, stretching thousands of miles from the Mediterranean to China, was simultaneously the world's greatest opportunity and one of its most lethal endeavors. The Silk Road wasn't a single road at all, but rather a web of pathways connecting east and west, a network that shifted and changed over centuries, responding to political upheavals, natural disasters, and the simple, brutal mathematics of survival. Merchants who traversed these routes weren't adventurers seeking glory. They were businessmen calculating risk against potential profit, and very often they calculated wrong. Tonight's journey will take us through 4 distinct landscapes of this ancient trade network. We'll begin by experiencing the daily realities of a merchant's life on the road, the relentless physical challenges, the ever-present dangers, the slow erosion of hope that came with month after month of travel. Then we'll follow in the footsteps of history's most famous Silk Road traveler, Marco Polo, examining the true hardships behind the legend. Our third segment will explore the silent cities left behind when the trade routes shifted, archaeological treasures that whisper their stories through fragments and fading manuscripts. Finally, we'll see the other side of the merchant's life, the splendid courts where successful traders lived in luxury that would astound even modern sensibilities. But for now, let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax. Imagine the weight of your modern life lifting away, replaced by the weight of something else entirely. A merchant's pack, perhaps, or the knowledge that tomorrow you'll wake before dawn to continue a journey that may never end. Let us begin. Picture yourself in a caravanserai on the eastern edge of Persia. The year is 1275, though such dates mean little to you. You measure time in seasons, in lunar cycles, in the number of days since you last saw your family. The caravanserai is a fortified rest stop, its thick mud brick walls offering protection from bandits and respite from the elements. You're not alone here. Perhaps 40 other travelers share this space, merchants like yourself, their servants, camel drivers, guards, translators, and the occasional pilgrim or diplomat hitching along for safety. The journey you're undertaking is not measured in days or weeks, but in years. If you're traveling from Venice to China, the full extent of the Silk Road, you're committing to perhaps 3 years on the road, possibly more. That's 3 years away from your family, 3 years of danger, 3 years of your life spent in a state of constant, calculated risk, and this assumes you survive. Many don't return at all. Your day begins before dawn. It always begins before dawn. The caravan master, a grizzled veteran who's made this journey 12 times and lost fingers to frostbite in the high passes, wakes everyone while stars still wheel overhead. There's wisdom in this early start. In the desert sections of the route, the pre-dawn hours offer the only tolerable traveling conditions. By mid-morning, the sun will transform the landscape into something actively hostile to human life. The camels are loaded with systematic precision. Each animal can carry approximately 400 pounds, and the distribution of weight is critical. Your goods, let's say you're carrying Persian carpets, hoping to sell them at enormous profit in Samarkand or beyond, must be balanced perfectly. An improperly loaded camel will develop sores, become lame, or simply refuse to move. And a lame camel in the desert is a death sentence, not just for the animal, but potentially for you. Every member of the caravan is linked in a chain of mutual dependence. One man's carelessness can doom everyone. You eat a simple breakfast, flatbread, perhaps some dried dates, tea if you're fortunate. Water is measured out with extraordinary care. The next reliable water source is 2 days away, and while camels can survive remarkable periods without drinking, humans are far more fragile. You're allowed a certain ration, enough to survive, not enough to feel comfortable. You'll be thirsty for the next 48 hours. This is simply expected. Constant nagging thirst is the merchant's companion, as familiar as the weight of your robe. The caravan moves out. 40 camels, perhaps more, their bells creating a discordant symphony in the pre-dawn darkness. The rhythm of their walking becomes the rhythm of your life. That swaying, rocking motion that continues hour after hour, day after day, until you feel it even in your sleep. If you're wealthy enough to own your own camel, you might ride. If you're a younger merchant still building your fortune, you walk. Many merchants walk the entire distance, thousands of miles on foot, their shoes wearing through and being replaced, wearing through and being replaced again. As the sun rises, it reveals the landscape you're crossing. Let's say you're in the Taklamakan Desert, whose name allegedly means go in and you won't come out. The Taklamakan is vast, about the size of Germany, and spectacularly inhospitable. Sand dunes rise like frozen waves, some reaching 900 feet in height. The sand itself has a peculiar quality. Fine as powder, it infiltrates everything. Your clothes, your food, your eyes, your mouth. You'll be finding sand in your belongings weeks after leaving the desert. You'll be coughing it up for days. The heat, once the sun is fully risen, is crushing. Not the pleasant warmth of a summer day, but an oppressive, suffocating presence that seems to press down on you from above, while simultaneously radiating up from the sand beneath your feet. Temperatures in the Taklamakan regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. The air shimmers. The horizon becomes unreliable, offering false images. Lakes that don't exist, cities that are merely heat distortion. The shapes of travelers who are nothing but tricks of light and desperate hope. The caravan master keeps everyone moving at a steady pace. Not fast, that would be fatal in this heat, but steady, always forward. The camels understand this rhythm better than the humans do. They've evolved for this landscape, their broad feet spreading weight across the sand. Their ability to close their nostrils against sandstorms, their famous capacity to survive without water. You study the camels sometimes during rest periods and you envy them. They belong here. You emphatically do not. Water becomes an obsession. You think about it constantly. The small amount you're allowed to drink does little to quench your actual thirst. It merely keeps you alive. Your lips crack and bleed. The inside of your mouth feels coated in dust. You fantasize about water the way a starving man fantasizes about food, rivers, pools, rain, the simple act of drinking until you feel satisfied rather than merely not dying. These thoughts circle endlessly through your mind as you walk, as you sway on camelback, as you lie awake at night in your tent listening to the wind. And the wind in the desert is its own presence, its own character in your journey. Sometimes it's absent entirely, and the stillness becomes eerie, unsettling. You find yourself missing the wind, as irritating as it usually is. More often, it blows constantly, that dry, abrasive wind that carries sand into every crevice. Your skin becomes raw, your eyes are perpetually irritated. The youngest members of the caravan, those on their first journey, often develop infections, their eyes swelling shut, forcing them to continue blind, led by others, praying the condition will resolve before something worse develops. But the wind, troublesome as it is, can become something far more dangerous. Sandstorms on the Taklamakan are legendary. The sky darkens, not gradually, but with shocking speed. The wind, which moments before was merely uncomfortable, suddenly howls with genuine fury. The sand it carries ceases to be an irritant and becomes a weapon. It scours exposed skin. It blinds. It chokes. When a sandstorm arrives, the entire caravan must stop. There's no question of continuing. You'd become lost within minutes, separated from the group, and lost in the Taklamakan means dead. Everyone huddles together. The camels are made to kneel, forming a kind of living barrier. The humans crouch behind them, wrapping their faces completely, leaving only the smallest gap to breathe through. You remain this way for hours, sometimes for an entire day. The wind screams. The sand piles up around you, on you, threatening to bury you even as you crouch there breathing. You don't speak. There's no point. The wind would steal your words anyway. You simply endure. And when the storm finally passes, you emerge to a transformed landscape. Dunes have shifted. Familiar landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a dead tree that helped with navigation, have disappeared, buried under new sand. The caravan master must reorient, must find the route again using the sun and stars, using instinct born of repeated journeys, using educated guesses that might be wrong. Sometimes caravans emerge from sandstorms to discover they've lost someone. A merchant or a servant, never seen again, swallowed by the storm and the sand. The caravan grieves briefly, very briefly, and moves on. There's no time for extended mourning. The desert offers no sympathy to the sentimental. The nights, by contrast, are brutally cold. The same desert that tried to kill you with heat 12 hours ago now attempts to freeze you. Temperatures can drop below freezing. You huddle in your tent, if you're wealthy enough to have your own tent, or you share space with others, pressing together for warmth. The cold seeps up from the ground. Your muscles, exhausted from the day's travel, cramp and ache. Sleep is difficult. You drift in and out of consciousness, never quite comfortable, never quite warm enough. You're not always in desert, of course. The Silk Road crosses multiple landscapes, multiple climate zones. If the deserts are brutally hot and cold, the mountain passes are something else entirely, perhaps even more dangerous. Imagine now that your caravan has successfully crossed the Taklamakan. You've survived sandstorms, you've rationed water successfully, you've avoided becoming lost. Ahead of you rise the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where peaks reach over 24,000 feet. Marco Polo, whom we'll discuss later, called these mountains so high that birds cannot fly over them and fires burn with less heat due to the thin air. He was remarkably accurate. The mountain passes of the Silk Road present, challenges entirely different from the deserts, but no less deadly. The air here is thin, oxygen poor, and you find yourself constantly short of breath. Every step requires extraordinary effort. What would be a simple walk at sea level becomes an exhausting ordeal at 15,000 feet. Your heart pounds, your head aches with the persistent throb of altitude sickness. Some members of the caravan develop severe altitude sickness. They become confused, they stumble, they may die if not taken to lower elevations quickly. The temperature in the high passes is consistently cold even in summer. Snow and ice are permanent features. The passes themselves are narrow, treacherous pathways along mountainsides with fatal drops just feet away. The camels, sure-footed in sand, become nervous and difficult here. They must be led with extraordinary care. One panicked animal could cause a cascade of disaster, camels and cargo tumbling down mountainsides, lives and fortunes lost in moments. Avalanches and rockfalls are constant dangers. The sound of falling rock becomes something you're perpetually alert for. Sometimes there's warning, a rumble, a distant crack. Sometimes there's none at all, and the trail ahead simply disappears under tons of stone and ice. If you're fortunate, the caravan can wait for the path to be cleared or find an alternate route. If you're not fortunate, you're trapped, and your food supplies begin their steady countdown toward starvation. The passes are also perfect territory for bandits. This is true throughout the Silk Road, but particularly in the mountains. A small group of armed men positioned along a narrow pass can hold up an entire caravan. The geography offers no room for maneuver, no way to flank or escape. You either pay what the bandits demand or you fight, and fighting on a narrow mountain trail where a single misstep means death is often a losing proposition. Bandits represent one of the merchant's constant calculations. You're carrying goods worth fortunes. Everyone knows this. The Silk Road doesn't exist for casual travelers. If you're on it, you're carrying something valuable. This makes every merchant a target. The guards you've hired, and you must hire guards, traveling without armed protection is suicide, are meant to discourage casual banditry, but they're not an army. Against a determined and well-organized bandit group, they may prove insufficient. Some bandit attacks are straightforward robberies. The bandits want your goods, and if you're sensible, you hand them over. You lose your fortune, your years of investment, but you keep your life. You return home, ruined but breathing. Other attacks are more brutal. Some bandit groups are less interested in trading goods than in violence for its own sake, or they simply kill to avoid leaving witnesses who might identify them later. The aftermath of such attacks is grim. Bodies left where they fell, stripped of anything valuable, quickly reclaimed by the desert or the mountains. The threat of bandits means you can never fully relax. Even in caravanserais, even in supposedly safe towns along the route, you remain vigilant. Your goods are guarded in shifts. Your weapons are close at hand. You develop the light, suspicious sleep of the perpetually endangered. After months of this, the stress becomes a constant weight, as exhausting as the physical demands of travel. And then there are the political dangers. The Silk Road crosses numerous kingdoms, empires, and tribal territories. Each one has its own rules, its own taxes, its own degree of stability or chaos. A route that was safe last year might be a war zone this year. An official who waved you through with minimal fuss on your last journey might be replaced by someone far more corrupt. Someone who invents elaborate reasons to confiscate your goods or demands impossible bribes. The taxes themselves are staggering. Every political boundary you cross means paying customs duties. Every city might impose its own fees. Local officials often have extraordinary latitude in setting these rates, and they know you're vulnerable. You've come too far to turn back. You've invested too much to give up. They squeeze you systematically and you pay, because the alternative is to abandon everything you've worked for. These taxes and bribes can consume a huge percentage of your profits. Some merchants calculate that for every 10 coins they hope to earn, 4 or 5 go to various officials along the route. This is simply the cost of doing business, but it means your margins are narrow. A single piece of bad luck, goods damaged by weather, a particularly greedy customs official, a minor bandit attack that takes just 20% of your cargo can transform a profitable journey into a loss. Disease is everywhere. The Silk Road connects distant populations, and with those connections comes the exchange of pathogens. Your immune system, developed in your home region, offers little protection against illnesses endemic to regions thousands of miles away. Dysentery is common, weakening travelers, sometimes killing them outright. Fevers come and go. Mysterious ailments strike randomly. One day a healthy young merchant, the next day a corpse wrapped in cloth and buried in foreign soil. The caravan moves on. Always it moves on. There's no time to convalesce properly, no hospitals, no real medical care beyond whatever folk remedies the travelers carry with them. You're sick, you keep moving. You're injured, you keep moving. You rest only when the entire caravan rests, and then only briefly. The logic is implacable. The longer you remain on the road, the more you consume precious supplies, the more you're exposed to danger. Speed is survival, even when speed means suffering. Let's discuss the economics more carefully, because understanding them helps explain why anyone would endure these hardships. A successful Silk Road journey could indeed make your fortune. Silk purchased in China might sell for 10 times its purchase price in the Mediterranean. Certain spices, certain dyes, certain luxury goods could yield even more extraordinary profits. A single successful round trip could transform you from a modest merchant into a wealthy man. But that's if everything goes right. The reality is that most journeys encountered significant losses. A third of your cargo might be lost to weather, theft or spoilage. Your actual profits, after taxes and expenses, might be far smaller than you calculated back home when the journey seemed like a good idea. And you won't know your final profit or loss until you return home and actually sell your goods, which might be 3 years after you departed. 3 years during which your family subsists on savings or charity, not knowing if you're alive or dead, wealthy or ruined. Some merchants never return. They die on the road, from disease, from violence, from accidents. They die in deserts and mountains, in cities from plague, in caravanserais from infected wounds or simple bad luck. Their goods are sold off by the caravan master or seized by local officials. Their families back home wait and eventually understand that the wait is pointless. The Silk Road claims a steady harvest of lives, year after year, century after century. Consider the psychological weight of this journey. You're away from everything familiar for years at a time. The landscape around you is hostile. The people you encounter often regard you with suspicion or outright hostility. You're a foreigner, an outsider, possibly a spy, definitely someone carrying wealth. The languages change constantly. In a single journey, you might need to communicate in Persian, Sogdian, Turkish, Mongol and Chinese, among others. Most merchants knew only a few phrases of each language, enough to negotiate prices, ask for water, plead for mercy. This communication barrier increases your isolation. You miss your family with an ache that never quite fades. If you have children, you imagine them growing up without you. If you're married, you wonder if your spouse will remain faithful, will remember you, will recognize you if you return. Letters are nearly impossible. The occasional message might be carried back along the route by another merchant, but it will take months or years to arrive, and you'll have no way of knowing if it reached home or was lost along the way. The loneliness is profound. Yes, you travel with others, but they're companions of circumstance, not true friends. Trust is conditional and carefully measured. Everyone has heard stories of merchants murdered by their own guards or cheated by business partners. You sleep lightly, you watch your back, you maintain cordial relations while keeping your true thoughts hidden. And through all of this, the physical hardship, the danger, the loneliness, the uncertainty, you must remain sharp enough to conduct business. When you reach a major trading city, you can't simply rest. You must navigate complex markets, evaluate goods, negotiate prices, guard against being cheated by more experienced local merchants who know every trick to extract additional profit from weary travelers. You must be alert, clever, suspicious but not paranoid, trusting but not naive. It's exhausting. The silk itself, the luxury good that gives the route its name, is fascinating in its particularity. Silk production was a closely guarded Chinese secret for centuries. The penalty for smuggling silkworms out of China was death. The West understood that silk came from some kind of creature. Theories ranged from a special spider to a peculiar plant, but the actual process remained mysterious. This monopoly allowed Chinese merchants and officials to charge extraordinary prices, and despite those prices, demand never wavered. The wealthy of Rome, Constantinople and Persia would pay almost anything for silk. It was cool in summer, warm in winter, it draped beautifully. It could be dyed the most vibrant colors. No other fabric compared. Eventually, of course, the secret escaped. Monks allegedly smuggled silkworms out of China in hollow bamboo staffs. Other smuggling attempts succeeded through other methods, but for centuries that monopoly held, and it was one of the primary drivers of Silk Road trade. Merchants endured all these hardships, largely because the potential profit from silk was so extraordinary. But silk was never the only commodity. The Silk Road carried everything valuable and portable. Spices like pepper, cinnamon and cloves flowed westward. Precious stones, jade, porcelain, lacquerware, tea. Westward too came inventions and ideas. Paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass. Eastward travelled gold, silver, wool, horses, glassware and wine. Ideas moved along the route as well. Religions, philosophies, artistic techniques, scientific knowledge. The Silk Road was a vast exchange network, a multicultural transmission system operating for over a millennium. As you travel, you notice the evidence of those who failed. Abandoned camels, too sick or injured to continue, left to die in the desert. Graves, some marked, most not, scattered along the route. The ruins of caravanserais that fell to bandits or were simply abandoned when routes shifted. Ghost towns, where thriving communities once existed, now empty, filled with wind and sand and silence. These silent testimonies remind you constantly of your own mortality, your own vulnerability. The return journey, if you successfully reach your destination and begin heading home, offers no relief. You face all the same dangers in reverse. You're carrying different goods now. You've sold what you brought and purchased new items to sell back home, but the perils haven't diminished. If anything, you might be more vulnerable. You're tired. The journey out exhausted you, and now you must do it all again. Your clothes are worn. Your supplies are depleted. The months or years of travel have aged you in ways that go beyond mere chronology. Some merchants, having completed one successful journey, immediately begin planning another. The profit is too attractive. The alternative, settling into a mundane life of local trade, seems unbearably dull after the intensity of the Silk Road. They become addicted, in a sense, to the danger and the potential reward. They make 2 journeys, 3, 5, and eventually their luck runs out. The desert claims them, or the mountains, or the bandits, or simply disease. They die far from home, their fortunes perhaps made but never enjoyed. Others complete one journey and never consider a second. They sell their goods, count their profits if they're lucky, nurse their trauma and their relief at being home. They tell stories, increasingly embellished over the years, of their adventures, but they never go back. The Silk Road has taken enough from them. They've survived once. They're not willing to test fate again. And still, despite all of this, despite the death and the hardship and the staggering risks, merchants continue to attempt the journey. The Silk Road functions for over 1,000 years, from roughly the 1st century BCE until well into the 15th century CE. Thousands of merchants, tens of thousands perhaps, make the journey successfully. More fail, but enough succeed to keep the dream alive. As you lie in your tent tonight, another day's journey completed, you listen to the sounds of the caravan, settling down for the night. Camels groaning as they kneel, men speaking in half a dozen languages, someone laughing at something. You miss the joke, if there was one. The wind moving across the sand, that constant susurration that becomes like silence after a while. You think about home. You calculate how many more days until the next major city, how many more weeks until you reach your ultimate destination, how many more months until you might begin the return journey. The numbers are large. The time ahead stretches out oppressively, but you've committed now. There's no turning back. Forward is the only direction that makes sense. And so tomorrow, you'll wake before dawn again. You'll eat your small breakfast, drink your rationed water, you'll check your goods, your camel, your supplies, you'll take your place in the caravan, and you'll move forward, one day's journey closer to your goal. One day older, one day more aware of exactly how fragile human life is against these vast landscapes of stone and sand. The Silk Road asks everything of those who travel it. It offers the possibility of wealth, yes, but it demands payment in suffering, in years of your life, in the constant proximity of death. Most people in history never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Silk Road merchants were different, driven by ambition or desperation or both, willing to stake everything on a journey that might make them wealthy or might simply make them another unmarked grave in a foreign desert. This was their reality. This was the price of connection, the cost of bringing East and West together. These routes, these desperately dangerous routes, were the internet of their age, the communication and trade network that allowed ideas and goods to flow across the vast expanse of Asia. And the bandwidth of that network was measured in human endurance, human suffering, and very often, human death. The year is 1271. A teenage boy stands on a dock in Venice, watching the final preparations for a journey that will consume the next 24 years of his life. His name is Marco Polo, and he's about to leave everything he knows for a world so foreign, so distant, that most Venetians believe it exists only in travelers' tales and fever dreams. Marco is 17 years old. He's never met his father. Niccolo Polo left Venice before Marco was born, vanished into the East on a trading expedition that was supposed to last 2 years, perhaps 3. That was 17 years ago. Marco's mother died while Niccolo was away, and the boy was raised by extended family, uncles and aunts, who spoke of his father as if he were a ghost, a memory, a man who probably died somewhere in Asia and whose death simply hadn't been confirmed yet. But Niccolo didn't die. He returned, he and his brother Maffeo, after an absence so long that Venice had nearly forgotten them. They returned with extraordinary stories, with gifts from a Mongol emperor, with an invitation to return to the court of Kublai Khan, the most powerful ruler on earth. And they're going back, and this time, incredibly, they're taking Marco with them. Imagine being that 17-year-old boy. Your father is a stranger. The longest journey you've ever taken was perhaps to another Italian city, a few days' travel at most. Now you're embarking on a journey that will take you across the entirety of Asia, into lands where no European tongue is spoken, where customs are incomprehensibly foreign, where dangers you can barely imagine wait around every turn in the road. You're excited, certainly. You're also terrified, though you'd never admit it. You're trying to be brave, to be worthy of your father's confidence, to prove yourself a man even though you're barely beyond childhood. The Polo family's journey will take approximately 3.5 years. 3.5 years just to reach Kublai Khan's court. Let that time span settle in your mind. 3.5 years of continuous travel, facing every danger we discussed in the previous segment, and more besides. Marco will survive this journey. That's not a spoiler. We know he survived because he eventually returned to Venice and dictated an account of his travels. But survival is not the same as ease, and the young man who arrives at Kublai Khan's court will be very different from the boy who left Venice. The Polos travel first through the Mediterranean, familiar waters for Venetian merchants. They stop at Acre in the Crusader states, where they meet with the papal legate. They're carrying letters from the Pope to Kublai Khan, part of a complex diplomatic dance between Christendom and the Mongol Empire. Then they push inland, moving through Armenia and into Persia. Persia in the 1270s is dangerous territory. The Mongol invasion several decades earlier devastated the region. Cities were destroyed, populations slaughtered, irrigation systems ruined. The land is still recovering, still haunted by the violence of its recent past. The Polos travel through landscapes dotted with ruins, past abandoned villages, through areas where bandits operate with near impunity because the old political order has collapsed and the new one is still establishing control. Marco falls ill in Persia. The details are vague in his later account. Perhaps he was reluctant to dwell on this period. But he's sick enough that the journey must pause for an extended period. Weeks, possibly months. Imagine young Marco, fevered and weak, his body rejecting this foreign land, hovering in that uncertain space between recovery and death. His father and uncle can do little but wait, watch, hope, and probably calculate how much this delay is costing them in supplies and lost opportunities. He recovers eventually. His youth serves him well, but he's had his first real taste of his own mortality, his first understanding that this journey could kill him as easily as make his fortune. The confidence of youth, already shaken by the realities of hard travel, erodes further. He's becoming cautious, wary, perhaps beginning to understand why his father was absent for 17 years. Not because he didn't care, but because the journey itself makes return impossibly difficult. They continue eastward, through Persia and into the high Pamir Mountains. We discussed these mountains earlier, but let's imagine them specifically through Marco's eyes. He's never seen mountains like these. The Alps exist, certainly, but the Pamirs are something else entirely. Higher, more remote, more hostile to human life. The air is thin enough that Marco struggles constantly for breath. Every step is an effort. The cold is worse than anything he experienced in Italian winters, a deep, bone-penetrating cold that no amount of clothing seems to adequately combat. Marco notices something strange in these mountains. Fires don't burn properly. Food doesn't cook right. He doesn't understand why. The concept of air pressure and its relationship to altitude won't be understood for centuries yet. But he notes the phenomenon carefully. He's developing the observer's eye that will make his later account valuable. He's learning to notice details, to record the strange and the unusual, to trust his own observations, even when they contradict what he thought he knew about the world. The descent from the Pamirs brings them into territories that shift and change their political allegiances with bewildering frequency. These are the borderlands of the Mongol Empire, regions where local lords offer nominal submission to distant Mongol overlords while maintaining their own power. The Polos must navigate this political complexity carefully. They carry letters of safe passage from Kublai Khan, obtained during Niccolo and Maffeo's previous journey. But these letters are only as effective as the local ruler's willingness to honor them. Some do. Others require additional persuasion in the form of gifts or bribes or simple flattery. They enter the Taklamakan Desert, that same wasteland we explored earlier. For Marco, this is his first desert, and its alien nature overwhelms him. He writes later about hearing phantom voices in the desert, sounds that seem to call travelers off the path. Modern readers sometimes interpret this as a poetic embellishment, but Marco was probably describing a real phenomenon. Wind patterns in the desert, combined with exhaustion and dehydration, can indeed produce auditory hallucinations. Travelers hear their names called. They hear music. They hear the sounds of caravans ahead or behind that don't exist. These phantom sounds have led countless people astray, wandering off alone into the dunes, never to be seen again. The Polos, guided by experienced caravan masters, resist these false voices. They maintain discipline, following the established route even when instinct suggests divergence. But Marco is learning another crucial lesson, that his own senses can't always be trusted, that the landscape itself can lie, that survival sometimes means ignoring what you think you hear or see, and instead following the hard-won knowledge of those who've traveled this route before. They pass through cities that dazzle Marco, Kashgar, with its bustling bazaars and its polyglot population speaking a dozen languages. Khotan, famous for jade and carpets. These cities are prosperous waypoints on the Silk Road, growing wealthy from the constant flow of merchants. Marco begins to understand the scale of the trade network, the sheer quantity of goods and money and people constantly in motion along these routes. Venice is a wealthy city, certainly, but these Central Asian trading centers operate on a scale he never imagined. The journey continues through the Gobi Desert, another vast wasteland, and then finally into the territories of China proper. The landscape changes. More cities, more people, more agriculture. They're entering one of the most sophisticated and populous civilizations on Earth, though Marco doesn't fully grasp this yet. He's still thinking in European terms, still assuming that European models of government and culture are the standard against which everything else should be measured. China will challenge these assumptions thoroughly. After 3.5 years, they reach Shangdu, Xanadu, in the anglicized version. that will later inspire Coleridge's opium-fueled poetry. This is Kublai Khan's summer capital, and it's here that Marco finally meets the man who will dominate the next 17 years of his life. Kublai Khan is in his late 50s when Marco meets him, a man of enormous power but also of visible age. He's the grandson of Genghis Khan, inheritor of an empire that stretches from Korea to Eastern Europe, ruler of perhaps a quarter of the world's population. He's also a man of surprising cultural sophistication. He's adopted many Chinese customs while maintaining his Mongol identity. He's interested in philosophy and religion. He's attempting to govern a vast multicultural empire through a combination of tolerance and calculated brutality. Kublai takes an interest in young Marco. The reasons aren't entirely clear. Perhaps Marco's youth appeals to him, fresh eyes, unencumbered by too much preconception. Perhaps the Khan simply finds Europeans novel and interesting. Perhaps he recognizes intelligence and curiosity in the young Venetian. Whatever the reason, Marco enters Kublai's service, and this is where his account becomes controversial. Marco claims to have served as an official in Kublai's administration, traveling throughout the empire on diplomatic missions, governing cities, observing military campaigns. Some historians accept this account. Others are deeply skeptical. Chinese records from the period don't mention Marco Polo, but then they wouldn't necessarily mention a foreign minor official. And Marco's name might have been rendered in Chinese characters that don't obviously correspond to Marco Polo in European languages. What's certain is that Marco spends approximately 17 years in China and surrounding territories. 17 years. He arrives as a teenager and leaves as a middle-aged man. His entire young adulthood unfolds in this foreign land, speaking foreign languages, surrounded by customs that never become entirely familiar, no matter how long he lives among them. Consider the psychological weight of this extended exile. Marco probably believes, during the early years, that he'll return to Venice relatively soon. A few years of service to the Khan, accumulating wealth and prestige, then back to Italy to enjoy the fruits of his travels. But years pass, and the Khan doesn't release them. Niccolò and Maffeo request permission to leave multiple times, politely, cautiously, knowing that one doesn't demand anything from an emperor who could have them killed with a word. Each time Kublai refuses. He values their service too much, or perhaps he simply sees no reason to grant their request. What are the wishes of foreign merchants against the preferences of an emperor? Marco begins to realize that he might die in China. He might never see Venice again, never speak Italian as his primary language, never live among his own people again. This knowledge, the possibility of permanent exile, must have been crushing. He becomes fluent in multiple Asian languages. He adopts local customs to a degree, but he never fully belongs. He's permanently foreign, permanently other, an observer even after nearly 2 decades in residence. The Mongol Empire, despite its fearsome reputation, operates with a degree of religious and cultural tolerance that would be remarkable in any era. Kublai's court includes Muslims, Buddhists, Christians of various denominations, shamans, Taoist priests. This tolerance is partly pragmatic. The empire is too vast and too diverse to enforce religious uniformity, but it also reflects a genuine Mongol tradition of religious openness. Marco, as a Christian in a non-Christian empire, is never persecuted for his faith. He's sometimes asked to explain Christian beliefs, to participate in religious debates, but he's not forced to convert or punished for his beliefs. Yet this tolerance doesn't make Marco's position comfortable. He's always aware of his foreignness, always conscious that he serves at the Khan's pleasure, and that pleasure could be withdrawn at any moment. He watches other foreign visitors to the court, Arab merchants, Persian diplomats, envoys from distant kingdoms, and he sees how precarious their positions are, how quickly they can fall from favor, how thoroughly they can disappear. The daily life Marco leads is complex. When he's at court, he participates in elaborate ceremonies, formal audiences, official functions that follow protocols developed over centuries and refined to an art. When he's traveling on the Khan's business, if indeed his account of such travels is accurate, he experiences China's extraordinary infrastructure. The Mongols maintained an extensive postal and courier system, with rest stations every 25 miles or so, fresh horses always available for imperial messengers. Marco, traveling on imperial business, would have access to this system. His travels would be faster and safer than a typical merchant's journey, though still not without danger. He sees landscapes that no European has documented before. He visits Hangzhou, perhaps the largest city in the world at that time, with a population of over 1 million. He sees the Grand Canal, that remarkable feat of engineering connecting the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. He observes Chinese innovations, paper money, which Europe won't adopt for centuries, the use of coal for heating, unfamiliar to Europeans, sophisticated hydraulic systems for irrigation and flood control, printing technology far in advance of anything in Europe. And he records what he sees, mentally at first, and later in his dictated account. He's not always accurate. He sometimes misunderstands what he's observing, sometimes reports hearsay as fact, sometimes embellishes for dramatic effect. But he's a more careful observer than he's often given credit for. Many details that skeptics once dismissed as fabrication have been confirmed by archaeological evidence or by comparison with Chinese sources from the same period. Marco witnesses the Khan's military campaigns, or at least their aftermath. The Mongol Empire in the 1270s and 1280s is still expanding, still conquering. There are campaigns against Song dynasty holdouts in southern China, against Annam and Champa in Southeast Asia, against Japan, twice, both ending in disaster when typhoons destroy the Mongol fleet. Marco describes battles in ways that suggest he either witnessed them personally or received detailed accounts from participants. His descriptions include the grim realities, the death toll, the destruction of cities, the treatment of prisoners. The Mongol way of warfare is brutal by any standard. Cities that resist are often destroyed completely, their populations massacred or enslaved as examples to other cities considering resistance. Armies number in the tens of thousands. The logistics of moving such forces, feeding them, maintaining discipline, Marco begins to understand how the Mongols conquered such a vast territory. It's not just their legendary horsemanship or their composite bows. It's their organizational capacity, their ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances, their systematic use of terror as a military strategy. Marco becomes, in a sense, complicit in this empire. He serves it. He benefits from its power. When he travels, he does so under Mongol authority, protected by Mongol force. The wealth he accumulates comes from Mongol favor. This is the moral complexity of his position. He's simultaneously an outsider and a participant, simultaneously awed by what he sees and implicated in its darker aspects. The years accumulate slowly. Marco is 20, then 25, then 30. He's no longer young. He's no longer the wide-eyed teenager who left Venice. He's become someone else, not quite European, not remotely Chinese. Something in between, something new. He thinks in multiple languages, dreams in a mixture of tongues. Venice becomes increasingly unreal in his memory, increasingly abstract. He wonders if he'll recognize it if he ever sees it again. He wonders if it will recognize him. Finally, in 1292, an opportunity presents itself. A Mongol princess is to be married to a Persian ruler. The overland routes are dangerous due to ongoing warfare. The Mongol court needs experienced travelers to escort the princess by sea around the coast of Asia. Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco volunteer for this mission. After 17 years, Kublai finally agrees to let them go. The sea journey is its own ordeal. They sail with a fleet of 14 ships carrying the princess and her entourage. The voyage takes approximately 2 years, following the coast through Southeast Asia, past India, and eventually to Persia. Of the 600 people who begin the journey, only 18 survive. Disease claims most of them, likely cholera or dysentery spreading through the crowded ships. The princess survives, protected by every precaution wealth and power can provide. The Polos survive through luck or divine favor or simple hardy constitution. Marco is now approximately 40 years old. He's been away from Venice for 24 years, longer than many people in medieval Europe lived. He's survived journey after journey, danger after danger. He's seen perhaps a quarter of the world, more territory than almost any European of his era, and finally, he's heading home. They deliver the princess to Persia, only to discover that her intended husband died while they were in transit. She's married to his son instead, a consolation arrangement that seems to satisfy everyone's political needs. The Polos receive payment for their service, and they continue westward, through Persia again, through Armenia, back to the Mediterranean, back, at last, to Venice. They arrive in 1295. Venice has changed in their absence. New buildings, new political alignments, familiar faces, aged or dead. The Polos themselves are unrecognizable. They're dressed in Mongol fashion, speaking Italian with strange accents, carrying themselves like foreigners. Their own relatives don't recognize them at first. The family home has been occupied by other relatives who assumed the Polos were dead. It takes time to re-establish their identity, to prove they are who they claim to be. Marco resettles into Venetian life, but he doesn't fit comfortably. He's too different now, too changed. He tries to resume his place in Venetian society, but he's permanently marked by his experiences. People want to hear his stories, but they don't quite believe them. China is too distant, too different, too exotic. Surely he's exaggerating, surely he's embellishing. Cities of 1 million people, paper money, coal for heating, these sound like fantasies. Marco develops a reputation. He's called Marco Milione, Marco of the millions, because he's always talking about millions of this or that, millions of people, millions in revenue, millions of stones in a bridge. The nickname is affectionate, but also slightly mocking. Marco becomes known as a teller of tall tales, a man not to be taken entirely seriously. Then in 1298, Venice goes to war with Genoa, its rival maritime republic. Marco commands a galley. He's wealthy enough and experienced enough for such a position. His ship is captured in battle. He's imprisoned in Genoa, thrown into a cell with other Venetian prisoners of war, facing an indefinite sentence until peace is negotiated. This imprisonment, paradoxically, gives us his account. Sharing his cell is a writer named Rustichello da Pisa, a man who makes his living writing romance tales. During the long, dull months of imprisonment, Marco dictates his travels to Rustichello. The resulting book, known variously as The Travels of Marco Polo, The Description of the World, or Il Milione, is one of the most important travel narratives ever written. But it's important to understand what this book is and isn't. It's not a diary. Marco isn't working from notes he took during his travels. It's dictated from memory, 25 years or more after some of the events described. It's shaped by Rustichello's literary sensibilities. He organizes it, he adds flourishes, he possibly invents or embellishes details. Marco's motive in dictating isn't purely historical. He wants to be believed, he wants to impress, he wants people to understand what he experienced. This affects how he tells his story. The book is successful. It spreads throughout Europe in manuscript form. This is before the printing press. It's translated into multiple languages. It's read by merchants, by nobles, by scholars. It influences European understanding of Asia for centuries. Christopher Columbus owns a copy and writes notes in the margins, dreaming of reaching the lands Marco described by sailing west instead of east. But Marco himself remains a somewhat controversial figure in Venice. Some people believe his account, others think he's a fraud, that he never went further than the Black Sea, that he's cobbling together stories heard from other travelers. The skepticism hurts him. He's traveled further than perhaps any European of his age. He's seen marvels and wonders and horrors, and his own people dismiss him as a storyteller, a fantasist. Marco lives the rest of his life in Venice. He marries late, as if he struggled to settle into domestic life. He has 3 daughters. He manages the family business, trading as Venetian merchants do, but never traveling far from home again. The Silk Road has taken enough from him. He's made his journey, paid his dues, earned his place in history. He doesn't need to tempt fate again. On his deathbed, according to legend, friends urge him to confess that he exaggerated his account, to admit that he made up the more extraordinary claims. Marco allegedly responds, "I have not told half of what I saw." Whether this story is true is uncertain. It's exactly the kind of dramatic deathbed declaration that gets invented or embellished in the retelling. But it captures something true about Marco's experience. The reality of what he saw, the scale of China, the sophistication of its civilization, the power of the Mongol Empire was so far beyond European experience that adequate description was nearly impossible. Marco Polo dies in 1324 at approximately age 70. By medieval standards, he lived a long life, though one could argue that his 17 years in China aged him in ways that simple chronology doesn't capture. He's buried in the Church of San Lorenzo in Venice. His grave doesn't survive. The church was rebuilt, and the location of his remains is unknown. His book survives, though, and it influences European understanding of Asia for generations. It's not always accurate. It contains errors, omissions, and probable fabrications, but it's also a remarkable achievement, a detailed account of lands and peoples that Europeans knew almost nothing about, dictated from memory by a man who spent his young adulthood in extraordinary circumstances. The scholarly debate about Marco Polo continues even today. Did he really go to China, or did he compile his account from Persian and Arab sources? If he went, was he as influential as he claimed, or was he a minor figure whose importance he exaggerated? The evidence is complex and sometimes contradictory. Chinese sources don't mention him, but they wouldn't necessarily. Some details he describes match Chinese and Persian sources from the period. Other details seem wrong or invented. Perhaps the most balanced view is that Marco did travel to China, did spend time in or around Kublai Khan's court, and did see many of the things he described. But his role was probably less central than he suggested, and his account was shaped both by the limitations of memory and by the demands of storytelling. He was both truth-teller and tale-spinner, both observer and embellisher, both historian and entertainer. What's certain is the cost. Marco spent 24 years away from home. His entire youth and early adulthood unfolded in foreign lands, in constant danger, in permanent alienness. He survived, but survival is not the same as victory. He returned wealthy but damaged, successful but never quite believed, famous but often mocked. The Silk Road gave him extraordinary experiences and took from him the possibility of a normal life. He was permanently marked by his journey, permanently changed, permanently caught between worlds. And perhaps this is the deeper truth about the Silk Road. It didn't just transport goods and ideas, it transformed people. Those who traveled it, who survived it, returned different from how they left. They'd seen too much, endured too much, understood too much about the world's vastness and their own smallness. Marco Polo, merchant of Venice, servant of the Khan, prisoner in Genoa, storyteller and memory keeper, he embodies both the glory and the tragedy of those who dared the journey. Imagine standing in a ruin. The wind moves through empty doorways, carrying sand that accumulates in the corners of rooms where families once slept, where merchants once counted their profits, where children once played games whose rules are now forgotten. The walls, made of mud brick, are eroding slowly, returning to the desert from which they came. In another century, perhaps two, there will be nothing here but shapeless mounds, and even those will eventually disappear, leaving no trace that humans ever lived in this place. This is Gaochang, or what remains of it. Once a thriving city on the northern route of the Silk Road, a crucial waypoint where caravans rested and merchants conducted business worth fortunes. At its height, perhaps 30,000 people lived within these walls. Now there are none. The city was abandoned centuries ago, left to the wind and the sand and the slow, patient work of time. Gaochang is not unique. The Silk Road is lined with dead cities, abandoned settlements, ruins that speak of prosperity followed by collapse. They're scattered across the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, Nia, Lulan, Miran, Jiaohe, Bezeklik. Some were abandoned suddenly, their residents fleeing war or disease. Others declined gradually as trade routes shifted, as water sources failed, as political powers rose and fell. Each has a story, though most of those stories are lost, recoverable only in fragments through careful archaeological work. Let's begin with Lulan, perhaps the most mysterious of these ghost cities. Lulan stood on the edge of Lop Nur, a salt lake in the Taklamakan Desert. The lake is gone now. It dried up completely in the 1960s, though it had been shrinking for centuries before that. But in ancient times, Lop Nur provided water in the midst of the desert, making Lulan possible, making life possible in a landscape otherwise too hostile for permanent settlement. Lulan appears in Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE. It was a kingdom, small but strategically positioned, controlling access to routes through the desert. The Chinese alternately allied with Lulan and fought against it, depending on whether Lulan's rulers leaned toward Chinese or Xiongnu influence. This was the fate of many small kingdoms along the Silk Road, caught between larger powers, forced to navigate impossible diplomatic situations. Their survival dependent on choosing the right overlord at the right time. The city was abandoned sometime around the 4th century CE. The exact date is uncertain. Chinese sources mention it less frequently than not at all. Travelers passing through the region reported ruins, empty buildings, no signs of life. The reasons for abandonment are debated. The lake may have shifted or shrunk, moving away from the city, making water access too difficult. War may have destroyed it. Disease may have killed or driven away the population. Perhaps all three factors combined, a cascade of disasters that made continued habitation impossible. Lulan remained lost for over a millennium. The desert reclaimed it, burying it under sand, erasing it from human knowledge. Then, in 1900, a Swedish explorer named Sven Hedin stumbled upon the ruins. Hedin was crossing the Taklamakan, nearly dying of thirst in the process, his experience matching those of countless merchants before him when his party discovered ancient structures emerging from the sand. What Hedin found was extraordinary. The extreme dryness of the desert had preserved materials that would have decayed anywhere else. Wood, fabric, paper, all survived, dried out but intact. He found documents written in an ancient language called Kharosti, used in the region but long extinct. He found Chinese texts on wooden tablets. He found everyday objects, tools, weapons, jewelry, children's toys. The city, though dead, had been mummified by the desert, its daily life frozen at the moment of abandonment. Later expeditions found more. In 1980, Chinese archaeologists discovered a female mummy near Lulan, naturally preserved by the dry conditions. She became known as the Beauty of Lulan. Though this romantic name obscures the reality, she was a woman who died approximately 4,000 years ago, her body wrapped in wool and buried in a simple grave. Her features are surprisingly well preserved. Her hair, her clothing, even her eyelashes survived. Looking at her face, and photographs of the mummy are available in scholarly publications, you're seeing an actual person from the distant past, not an artist's reconstruction, not a description in a text, but an actual human being. The beauty of Lulan raises intriguing questions. Her features don't match what we typically think of as East Asian. She appears Caucasian or European in ancestry. This isn't entirely surprising. Genetic and archaeological evidence shows that the Tarim Basin, where Lulan stood, was populated by peoples of mixed ancestry, with migrations from both east and west. The Silk Road facilitated not just trade, but also human movement, intermarriage, the mixing of populations. The people of Lulan were products of this mixing, living at a crossroads, biologically and culturally hybrid. Move now to another ruin, further west, Nia, located along a different branch of the Silk Road. Nia was discovered in 1901 by Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist whose expeditions into Central Asia recovered an enormous quantity of artifacts and documents. Stein's methods would be considered problematic today. He removed artifacts from their countries of origin, depositing them in British and Indian museums, and his excavation techniques were crude by modern standards. But he worked in an era when such practices were normal, and his discoveries revolutionized understanding of Silk Road history. At Nia, Stein found a city preserved much like Lulan, buried by sand, its buildings and contents intact. He excavated houses, finding furniture still in place, dishes on tables, as if the inhabitants had simply walked away. He found documents, hundreds of them, written in Kharosthi on wooden tablets. These documents are remarkable. They're not grand historical narratives or philosophical treatises. They're bureaucratic records, legal contracts, personal letters, the mundane paperwork of daily life. Reading these Nia documents, translated and published by scholars over the past century, you encounter the actual voices of Silk Road inhabitants. Here's a contract for the sale of a camel. Here's a letter from a woman asking her husband to send fabric. Here's a legal judgment in a property dispute. Here's an inventory of goods in a merchant's storehouse. These are people dealing with ordinary concerns: money, property, family, business. The exotic backdrop of the Silk Road fades, and what remains is simply humanity, people navigating the same basic challenges humans have always faced. One document from Nia is particularly poignant. It's a letter from a soldier stationed at a remote outpost, complaining about his difficult conditions and asking for supplies. The tone is weary, slightly resentful. The voice of someone stuck in an unpleasant posting far from home, counting days until his service ends. You can hear the echo of soldiers throughout history in his words, the universal experience of military service, of being sent to inhospitable places, of longing for home while enduring present hardship. These documents tell us something crucial. The Silk Road, for all its historical importance, was lived day by ordinary people doing ordinary things. Grand narratives of cultural exchange and historical transformation can obscure this fundamental truth. Most people along the Silk Road weren't merchants or diplomats or adventurers. They were farmers, craftspeople, servants, soldiers, people living their lives in particular places at particular times, shaped by but not obsessed with the larger historical forces moving around them. Nia, like Lulan, was abandoned. The dates are uncertain, but probably sometime in the 3rd or 4th century CE. Again, the reasons are debated. Climate change, warfare, a shift in trade routes, the failure of irrigation systems. What's certain is that the city died, its population left or perished, and the desert gradually buried what remained, preserving it accidentally for modern archaeologists to discover. Let's move to the Mogao Caves near Dunhuang, a different kind of archaeological site. The Mogao Caves aren't a dead city, but rather a religious complex. Nearly 500 Buddhist caves carved into a cliff face, decorated with murals and containing manuscripts and art spanning roughly 1,000 years. Dunhuang itself was a major Silk Road oasis, the last stop before travelers entered the Taklamakan Desert, or the first stop upon emerging from it. The caves were a pilgrimage site, a monastery, a place where the spiritual and commercial aspects of the Silk Road intersected. The caves were carved beginning around the 4th century CE and were used continuously until approximately the 14th century. During this millennium, artists covered the walls with murals depicting Buddhist stories, celestial beings, and scenes of daily life. The murals are extraordinary. Vivid colors, intricate details, thousands of individual figures. Standing in these caves, and some are open to visitors today, you're surrounded by medieval art, layer upon layer of images, each layer representing a different century, a different artistic tradition, a different vision of the divine. But the most significant discovery at Mogao wasn't the murals. It was a sealed chamber discovered in 1900 by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu. Wang found a hidden doorway in one of the caves, and behind it, a small room absolutely packed with manuscripts. Thousands of manuscripts, stacked floor to ceiling, sealed away sometime around the 11th century for reasons that remain unclear. This was the library cave, and its contents revolutionized understanding of medieval Asian history. The manuscripts were in multiple languages: Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, and others. They covered diverse topics, Buddhist scriptures certainly, but also Confucian texts, Taoist writings, Christian documents, secular literature, commercial records, personal letters, mathematical treatises, medical texts, music notation. It was a snapshot of the intellectual and religious diversity of the Silk Road, preserved by accident in that sealed chamber. Aurel Stein visited Dunhuang in 1907, persuaded Wang to sell him a large portion of the manuscripts and ship them to Britain. French sinologist Paul Pelliot arrived shortly after, acquiring more manuscripts for France. This removal of cultural heritage was catastrophic from a modern preservation perspective, and it remains controversial. However, it also meant that these manuscripts were catalogued, studied, and published, becoming available to international scholarship. Many manuscripts left in China were damaged or destroyed during the political upheavals of the 20th century, so the removed materials, ironically, may have been preserved by their displacement. Reading through the Dunhuang manuscripts, many are now digitized and available online, you encounter an astonishing range of material. There are multiple versions of Buddhist sutras, allowing scholars to trace how texts changed as they were copied and transmitted. There are primers for learning foreign languages, suggesting that Dunhuang was a place where merchants and monks needed to communicate across linguistic barriers. There are contracts and bills of sale, documenting the commercial transactions that made Silk Road trade possible. One manuscript contains the earliest known printed text, a Chinese Buddhist sutra dated to 868 CE, printed using woodblock printing. This technology existed in China centuries before Gutenberg's printing press, though it never developed the same revolutionary impact in Asia that printing had in Europe. The manuscript is called the Diamond Sutra, and it's beautifully produced, with intricate illustrations and careful calligraphy. Holding a reproduction, or viewing images of the original, you're touching the history of information technology, seeing one of humanity's great innovations in its early form. The manuscripts are more peculiar. There are mathematical problems with solutions, suggesting these were teaching materials. There are medical prescriptions for various ailments, mixing herbal remedies with magical incantations, reflecting the blurred boundaries between medicine and religion in medieval thought. There are lists, endless lists, of goods, prices, taxes, inventories. The bureaucratic machinery of empire and commerce operated on paper, and some of that paper survived. There are also Christian manuscripts, specifically Nestorian Christian texts in Chinese. Nestorian Christianity was a variant of Christianity considered heretical by Roman and Byzantine orthodoxy, and it spread eastward along the Silk Road, finding communities of believers as far as China. These texts are translations of Christian prayers and liturgy into Chinese, adapted to make sense in a Chinese cultural context. Reading them, you see Christianity struggling to express itself in a language and conceptual framework very different from its Mediterranean origins. God becomes the luminous Lord. The Trinity is explained using Buddhist philosophical terminology. It's Christianity, but Christianity transformed, hybridized, made new by its encounter with Asian cultures. The Mogao caves themselves, beyond the library cave, offer a different kind of evidence, visual rather than textual. The murals depict donors, wealthy patrons who funded the carving and decoration of particular caves. These donors are shown in portraits, wearing the fashions of their era, demonstrating the mixing of styles that characterize the Silk Road. Chinese robes, Central Asian patterns, sometimes elements that appear to derive from Persian or even Western influences. The portraits are individualized. These aren't generic figures, but specific people, presumably resembling their actual appearance. They wanted to be remembered, and they were, frozen on these walls for over 1,000 years. Some murals depict scenes of daily life, often in the background of religious narratives. You see musicians with their instruments, dancers in mid-movement, merchants conducting business, caravans traveling through mountains. These glimpses of ordinary activity are invaluable for historians trying to reconstruct what life actually looked like. How people dressed, what tools they used, how they arranged their living spaces. All of this appears in these paintings, not as the primary subject, but as incidental detail, which makes it all the more reliable. The artists weren't trying to document daily life. They were simply painting their world as background for religious stories. The decline of the Mogao caves began as the Silk Road itself declined. As sea routes became more important for trade, as the Mongol Empire fractured, as political instability made overland travel too dangerous, the economic vitality of cities like Dunhuang faded, fewer pilgrims visited, less funding flowed to the monastery. The caves continued to be used, but new construction ceased. By the Ming dynasty, Dunhuang was a backwater, militarily important as a frontier garrison, but no longer a major commercial or religious center. The caves were gradually forgotten, known to locals, but not to the wider world. Sand accumulated, some caves collapsed, others were damaged by water infiltration or by locals using them for storage or shelter. When Wang Yuanlu discovered the library cave, he didn't fully understand the significance of what he'd found. He sold manuscripts to foreign explorers because he needed money to fund restoration work on the caves, and the foreigners offered more money than he could raise locally. It was preservation through dispersal, not ideal, but perhaps better than the alternative of total loss. Let's shift now to another category of archaeological evidence, the goods themselves, the actual trade items that moved along the Silk Road. Museums around the world contain Silk Road artifacts, pulled from tombs and ruins, offering tangible evidence of the trade network's extent. Glass vessels from the Roman Empire have been found in Chinese tombs dating from the Han Dynasty. These vessels traveled thousands of miles, passed from merchant to merchant, their value increasing with each transaction until they reached China and were valuable enough to be buried with wealthy individuals. The glass itself is Roman in manufacture. Chemical analysis confirms this, but the journey it took is purely Silk Road, purely the result of this vast exchange network. Chinese silk has been found in Egyptian tombs and in Roman archaeological sites. The fabric survives because tombs and certain dry conditions preserve organic materials that would otherwise decay. Examining this silk, researchers can determine its quality, its weaving technique, sometimes even identify which region of China it likely came from. Each piece of fabric represents a journey of thousands of miles, represents multiple merchants taking their profits. represents the complex chain of exchange that made the Silk Road function. Central Asian carpets, Persian metalwork, Indian textiles, spices from Southeast Asia, all of these moved along the trade routes, and traces of them appear in archaeological contexts far from their points of origin. Each artifact is evidence of connection, of the web of trade that linked distant civilizations. But not all evidence is physical objects. Sometimes it's biological. Genetic studies of populations across Asia show patterns of mixing that correspond to trade routes. People moved along with goods, married outside their original populations, created genetically hybrid communities. The Silk Road was a highway not just for commodities and ideas, but also for genes, for the fundamental human drive to migrate, to mix, to create something new through combination. Diseases moved too. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, likely traveled westward along Silk Road trade routes, carried by merchants and their goods, spreading from community to community until it reached the Mediterranean and then ravaged Europe. The Silk Road's connectivity meant that epidemics couldn't remain localized. What started as an outbreak in one region could become a pandemic affecting continents, killing millions. This was the dark side of connection, the price of the network that otherwise brought wealth and knowledge. Language itself carries traces of the Silk Road. Words moved along with goods. Silk, in many European languages, derives ultimately from Chinese. Tea comes from Chinese dialects, its pronunciation slightly different depending on which route the word traveled, maritime or overland. Caravan comes from Persian. Bazaar similarly has Persian origins. These loan words, embedded in multiple languages, are linguistic fossils, evidence of contact and exchange preserved in vocabulary. Consider the city of Jiaohe, another ruined settlement in the Tarim Basin. Jiaohe is unusual because it's built not up from the ground but down into it. The city sits on a plateau, and its buildings were carved out of the plateau's loess soil, creating a kind of negative architecture. Streets are trenches, buildings are standing blocks of compressed earth, carved to shape rather than built up from foundations. This technique made Jiaohe defensible. The plateau's edges are sheer drops, difficult to scale. It also made the city distinctive, unlike anywhere else on the Silk Road. Walking through the ruins today, and tourists can visit, you move through corridors that feel ancient, claustrophobic, otherworldly. The buildings have eroded considerably, but their basic forms remain, allowing archaeologists and visitors to understand the city's layout, to see where markets operated, where temples stood, where the wealthy lived versus the poor. Jiaohe was abandoned in the 14th century. Around the same time, many Silk Road cities declined. Warfare was involved. The city shows signs of fire, of destruction. But the exact circumstances are lost. The city's records, if they existed, didn't survive. What remains is the physical evidence, the mute testimony of walls and streets, allowing only partial reconstruction of the city's history. The archaeological study of the Silk Road is ongoing. New discoveries still happen. New technologies allow new interpretations of old evidence. Ground-penetrating radar can locate buried structures without excavation. Chemical analysis can determine where raw materials originated. DNA analysis of human remains reveals population movements and relationships. Carbon dating provides increasingly precise chronologies. Each advance in archaeological science allows deeper understanding of this vast historical phenomenon. But there's something melancholy about studying dead cities, isn't there? Walking through these ruins, reading these ancient documents, handling artifacts from abandoned settlements, you're encountering the aftermath of failure. These cities don't exist anymore. The people who lived in them are gone. Their languages, in many cases, are extinct. Their kingdoms have vanished from the map. What remains are fragments, hints, shadows of what once was. Yet there's also something profound in this archaeological record. These ruins and artifacts prove that the Silk Road existed, that it functioned, that it connected disparate civilizations in ways that shaped human history. Without physical evidence, we might doubt the historical accounts. Marco Polo's narrative might seem too fantastic. Chinese descriptions of Western lands might appear exaggerated, but the artifacts don't lie. Roman glass in Chinese tombs, Chinese silk in Roman contexts, Persian manuscripts in Chinese caves. These are concrete, undeniable proof of connection. And occasionally, the evidence is startlingly personal. A letter written on silk, discovered in a tomb from a soldier to his family, a child's shoe preserved in a collapsed building, a merchant's seal with his name still legible. These objects close the distance between past and present, between their world and ours. For a moment, holding that soldier's letter or looking at that child's shoe, the past becomes immediate, becomes real in a way that historical narratives often aren't. The Silk Road's physical legacy is one of ruins and fragments, yes, but also one of survival. Despite war, despite natural disasters, despite the passage of many centuries, despite the determined erasure of time and wind and sand, something remains. Not everything, but something, enough to reconstruct partial stories, to understand partial truths, to recognize the human faces behind the historical grand narrative. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those ruins under starlight. Imagine the wind moving through Gaochang's empty streets, through Lulan's buried buildings, through the caves at Mogao, where murals depict long-dead donors and ancient deities. Imagine the manuscripts in their sealed chamber, waiting centuries for someone to find them, to read them, to give voice again to the dead. The Silk Road cities are silent now. The merchants are dust. The caravans no longer travel, but the evidence remains, scattered across thousands of miles of desert and mountain, waiting in museums and archaeological sites, speaking its quiet testimony to anyone willing to listen. The road is gone, but it left its marks, and those marks tell stories, incomplete, fragmentary, but precious precisely because they survived at all. Imagine yourself waking in near darkness to the sound of a handbell, its insistent clanging cutting through the cold air of an early morning in 1580s England. You are lying on a thin straw mattress, one of perhaps 20, arranged in neat rows in a long, drafty room. The walls are plain plaster, once whitewashed, but now greyed with age and the smoke from insufficient fires. There are no curtains at the small windows, no privacy between the sleeping bodies around you. The person to your left is an elderly man whose cough kept you awake for much of the night. To your right lies a young woman, recently widowed, her two small children pressed against her for warmth. This is the poorhouse, sometimes called the workhouse, though the Tudors themselves often referred to it simply as the House of Correction or the common hospital. You have ended up here not through any particular moral failing, though society will assume otherwise, but through the simple mathematics of misfortune. Perhaps you were a laborer whose strength gave out. Perhaps your husband died and left you with no means of support. Perhaps the small plot of land your family had worked for generations was enclosed by a wealthy landowner, turning you from a tenant farmer into a wanderer. The reasons people arrive at the poorhouse are many, but the experience that awaits them inside is grimly uniform. The bell continues its ringing. Around you, bodies begin to stir with reluctant movements. There is no rushing here, no energetic leaping from bed. Most of your fellow inmates move with the slowness of the malnourished, the ill, or the simply defeated. The overseer of the house, a stern man appointed by the parish, appears at the doorway. He does not need to raise his voice. Everyone knows what is expected. You rise and join the shuffling line moving toward the washing room, a small chamber with a few buckets of cold water and some coarse rags. The water is changed once per day, if you are fortunate. which means that by the time you reach it in the morning, it already carries the grime of those who washed before you. You splash it on your face anyway, the shock of coldness helping to drive away the last remnants of troubled sleep. There is a single piece of lye soap, worn down to almost nothing, shared among all the inmates. You are allotted perhaps 30 seconds at the washing station before you must move along to make room for the next person. The clothing you wear is not your own. Upon entering the poorhouse, your personal garments were taken from you and replaced with the institution's uniform, a coarse woolen smock in a dull grey or brown, marked in some way to identify you as a pauper. Perhaps there is a badge sewn onto the shoulder, or perhaps the cut of the cloth itself is distinctive enough that anyone seeing you on the street, should you ever be granted leave to walk there, would know immediately where you came from. This uniform serves a dual purpose. It ensures that you cannot easily run away and attempt to blend into ordinary society, and it marks you with the visible stigma of your status. You are not merely poor, you are institutionally poor, a different category of human being in the eyes of Tudor society. The morning meal is taken in the common room, a larger chamber with long wooden tables and benches worn smooth by years of use. The room smells of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the faint sourness of yesterday's meal. Small windows set high in the walls provide minimal light and even less ventilation. You take your place on a bench, careful not to jostle the person beside you. Tempers run short in places like this, and even minor conflicts can result in punishment. The meal arrives in large wooden bowls, carried by other inmates who have been assigned to kitchen duty. Breakfast consists of gruel, a watery porridge made from oats or sometimes barley, boiled in water with perhaps a pinch of salt, if the parish can afford such luxury. There is no milk to soften it, no honey to sweeten it, no butter to enrich it. You receive your portion, a small bowlful, measured carefully to ensure that the poorhouse's limited resources stretch to feed everyone, and a piece of coarse bread, dark and heavy, often containing more chaff than flour. You eat slowly, not from any desire to savor the meal, but because your shrunken stomach cannot accommodate large quantities at once, and because there is no reason to hurry toward what comes next. Around you, others eat in silence. Conversation is not explicitly forbidden during meals, but people have little energy for talk, and the overseer discourages any gathering that might lead to complaint or conspiracy. The children present, and there are always children in the poorhouse, either orphaned or accompanying their destitute parents, eat with the focused intensity of the chronically hungry, their eyes hollowed out by the inadequacy of their diet. The entire meal lasts perhaps 15 minutes. When the overseer rings his bell again, you must stop eating, whether you have finished or not. The bowls are collected, the tables wiped down by those on cleaning duty, and everyone proceeds to the next phase of the day. Now comes the true purpose of the poorhouse, the activity that gives it its alternative name of workhouse. You file into a large room lined with benches, each position marked with a small pile of tarred rope. This is oakum, old rope from ships, stiff with tar and salt, which must be picked apart fibre by fibre until it returns to its original loose state. The separated fibres will be sold to shipyards, where they will be used for caulking the seams of vessels. It is tedious, painful work that requires no skill, only endurance, which makes it perfectly suited for the purpose the parish authorities have in mind. You take your seat on the hard wooden bench and reach for the first piece of rope. Your fingers, if you are new to the poorhouse, will start out relatively soft, but that will not last long. The tar is harsh against your skin. The rope is rough, filled with sharp fibers that dig into your fingertips as you work to separate them. You pull and twist, tease apart the strands, work your thumbs into the gaps to pry the rope open. It is slow going. A single piece of rope might take 15 or 20 minutes to reduce to its component fibers, and you will be expected to process many pieces over the course of the day. The room is quiet, except for the rustle of rope and the occasional cough or sigh. The overseer walks among the benches, observing everyone's progress. Those who work too slowly receive a reprimand. Those who stop to rest their aching hands are told sharply to resume their labor. The message is clear. You are here not merely to receive food and shelter, but to earn it through your work, and furthermore to be reminded constantly of your lowly status. The oakum picking serves no rehabilitative purpose, teaches you no useful trade, and provides barely enough value to offset the cost of keeping you. Its real function is moral and psychological, to make the experience of being in the poorhouse sufficiently unpleasant that you will do almost anything to avoid having to return once you leave, and to serve as a deterrent to others who might be considering seeking parish relief. After the first hour, your fingertips begin to ache. After the second hour, they begin to bleed. The tar works its way into the small cuts and abrasions, stinging viciously. You cannot stop. You cannot ask for water to rinse your hands. You simply continue pulling at the rope, fiber by fiber, adding your small production to the pile of processed oakum that sits in a barrel at the front of the room. Time passes strangely in the workroom. The lack of any clock or timepiece means you cannot measure the hours, and the monotony of the task makes each moment stretch out until it feels almost infinite. You fall into a kind of trance, your hands moving mechanically while your mind drifts elsewhere. Perhaps you think about your life before the poorhouse, about the series of misfortunes that brought you here. Perhaps you think about nothing at all, achieving a state of blank endurance that makes the work slightly more bearable. Around you, others are engaged in the same labor. The old man who slept near you struggles with the rope, his arthritic fingers barely able to grip it. He works as best he can, knowing that failure to meet expectations might mean a reduction in his already meager rations, or a spell in the punishment cell. The young widow works steadily, her face set in an expression of grim determination. Her children, too young for oakum picking, have been assigned to simpler tasks elsewhere. Perhaps sorting rags or sweeping floors, anything to ensure that even the youngest inmates are contributing their labor to the household. The social hierarchy of the poorhouse is subtle, but present. Those who have been here longest, who know how to navigate the overseer's moods and the unwritten rules of institutional life, occupy a slightly elevated status. They might be given marginally less unpleasant tasks, or trusted to supervise others, or granted tiny privileges that mean nothing to the outside world, but everything here. A few extra minutes at the washing station, a slightly larger portion at dinner, permission to sit near the fire on cold evenings. These small distinctions matter enormously in a place where everything else has been stripped away. When the sun reaches its zenith, though you cannot see it clearly through the small, grimy windows, the overseer finally rings his bell to signal the midday break. You set down your rope, your fingers cramping as you release your grip. Around you, others do the same, some flexing their hands to restore circulation, others simply sitting in exhausted silence. The midday meal is similar to breakfast, more gruel, perhaps with a few scraps of vegetable if the poorhouse has received any donations from charitable parishioners. Sometimes there might be a small portion of cheese or a bit of bacon fat to flavor the gruel. But these additions are rare and unpredictable. You eat your portion slowly, mechanically, fueling your body for the afternoon's labor. There is a brief period after the meal when you are permitted to rest, perhaps half an hour. Some inmates use this time to attend to personal needs, mending their institutional clothing, writing letters if they are literate and have access to paper and ink, or simply lying down to rest their exhausted bodies. Others sit in small groups, talking in low voices about their circumstances, sharing information about which parishes might have work available or which landowners might need seasonal labor. These quiet conversations are one of the few ways that inmates maintain any connection to the world beyond the poorhouse walls, any sense that their current situation might not be permanent. But the respite is brief. Soon the bell rings again, and you return to the workroom, to the oakum, to the endless picking and pulling that will occupy the rest of your day. The afternoon is in many ways more difficult than the morning. Your fingers are now raw and bleeding, your back aches from sitting on the hard bench, and the monotony of the task has become almost unbearable. You work more slowly now, unable to maintain the morning's pace, and the overseer notes this with disapproval. He makes his rounds more frequently in the afternoon, perhaps aware that this is when inmates are most likely to slack off or rebel. The light from the windows gradually shifts and dims as the day progresses toward evening. In winter, darkness comes early, and candles or rushlights must be lit to allow the work to continue. These provide minimal illumination, creating more shadows than light, but they are deemed sufficient for the simple task of picking oakum. You strain your eyes in the dimness, pulling at rope you can barely see, guided more by touch than sight. Some days there are variations in the routine. Sometimes you might be assigned to different work, picking apart old clothing to reclaim any usable fabric, or breaking stones for road repairs, or working in the poorhouse garden if there is one. These alternative tasks might seem like a relief at first, but they prove equally monotonous and exhausting. The breaking of stones is perhaps worse than oakum picking, as it requires more physical strength and leaves your arms and shoulders aching. The garden work, at least, offers the benefit of being outdoors, away from the close air and oppressive atmosphere of the workhouse interior. But it is available only in the growing season, and only to those inmates deemed trustworthy enough not to attempt escape. Finally, as the light fails completely, the bell rings to signal the end of the workday. You set down your rope for the last time and file out of the workroom with the other inmates. Your hands throb, your back aches, your spirit feels heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow will bring an exact repetition of today's routine, and the day after that, and the day after that, stretching forward into an indefinite future. The evening meal is the most substantial of the day, though that is a relative term. There might be a thin stew, vegetables boiled in water with perhaps a small amount of meat, offcuts and scraps that no one else would want, gristly and tough. Or there might be pottage, a thick soup made from peas or beans, filling if not nutritious. You eat your portion carefully, knowing that this will be your last food until tomorrow's breakfast, and that the night ahead will be long and cold. After the meal, there is a brief period of what the authorities call moral instruction. The overseer, or perhaps a local clergyman, delivers a lecture on the virtues of hard work, the dangers of idleness, and the importance of accepting one's station in life with Christian resignation. The message is clear. Your poverty is the result of your own failings, and your time in the poorhouse is both punishment and opportunity, a chance to reform your character and learn the value of labor. That the wages of this labor go not to you, but to the parish, and that the labor itself is designed to be as unpleasant as possible, seems not to trouble the authorities who devise such arguments. Some evenings there might be a psalm sung or a reading from Scripture, carefully selected passages emphasizing humility and obedience. You stand or sit through these proceedings in weary silence, too exhausted to take in much of what is being said, waiting only for permission to retreat to the dormitory. One of the cruelest aspects of life in the Tudor poorhouse is the separation of families. If you entered the institution as part of a family unit, you were likely separated almost immediately. Men sleep in one dormitory, women in another, children in a third. Married couples are not permitted to share quarters. Parents see their children only during the common meals and work periods, and even then they are discouraged from sitting together or displaying affection. The logic behind this policy is twofold. It prevents the conception of new children who would become additional burdens on the parish, and it disrupts the family bonds that might give inmates the emotional strength to resist or protest their treatment. Imagine being a mother, forced to watch your children from across the common room, unable to comfort them when they cry, unable to hold them when they are sick. Imagine being a father who must sit helplessly while his family suffers, his traditional role as provider and protector rendered meaningless by the institution's rules. The psychological anguish of these separations is perhaps worse than any physical hardship the poorhouse imposes. Some children, particularly orphans, or those whose parents are deemed unfit, are apprenticed out from the poorhouse to local tradespeople or farmers. This is presented as a charitable opportunity, a chance for the child to learn a useful trade and eventually become a productive member of society. In reality, these apprenticeships often amount to little more than unpaid servitude. The child is bound to the master for a period of years, sometimes until they reach adulthood. And during that time, they have no legal recourse if they are mistreated, underfed, or worked beyond their strength. Some masters are decent and do genuinely teach their apprentices a trade. Others view parish apprentices as free labor to be exploited as ruthlessly as possible. Beyond the physical hardships and the family separations, perhaps the most enduring burden of life in the poorhouse is the stigma it carries. To be a pauper in Tudor England is to occupy the very lowest rung of the social ladder, below even the common labourer or servant. It is to be viewed as morally suspect, lazy, improvident, and generally undeserving of help beyond the bare minimum required by Christian charity and civil order. This stigma clings to you even if you manage to leave the poorhouse and find work again. People know where you have been. Your poorhouse clothing marked you while you were inside. The rumors and whispers mark you once you're outside. Employers are reluctant to hire former paupers, landlords reluctant to rent to them, and neighbors reluctant to associate with them. The taint of pauperism is not easily washed away. The authorities actively cultivate this stigma, believing it serves a useful social function. If the experience of poverty is made sufficiently shameful and unpleasant, people will work harder to avoid it, accepting lower wages and worse working conditions rather than risk falling into destitution. The poorhouse thus functions not only as a repository for those who have already fallen through the cracks, but as a threat to those still clinging to the edge, a reminder of what awaits if they fail to be sufficiently industrious and obedient. The conditions in the poorhouse make it a breeding ground for disease. The crowded dormitories, the poor ventilation, the inadequate diet, and the generally weakened state of the inmates create perfect conditions for illness to spread. Fevers sweep through the population regularly. Respiratory ailments are common, worsened by the cold and damp of the buildings. Skin conditions, parasites, and digestive complaints are endemic. When someone falls seriously ill, there is little that can be done. Medical care, such as it exists in Tudor England, is beyond the reach of paupers. The poorhouse might have access to a local physician who visits occasionally, but his treatments are likely to be ineffective even by the standards of the time, and he is unlikely to expend much effort on patients who cannot pay and who society regards as expendable. More often, sick inmates are simply isolated in a separate room and left to either recover or die with minimal intervention. Death is a frequent visitor to the poorhouse. The old, the very young, and the chronically ill are particularly vulnerable. When someone dies, their body is removed with little ceremony. There might be a brief religious service, but the burial is usually in an unmarked grave in the poorhouse cemetery or a pauper's section of the parish churchyard. No memorial stone marks the spot. The deceased's few possessions, if any, are recycled back into the institution. Within days, it is as if they never existed, their place on the dormitory sleeping mat already occupied by some new, unfortunate soul. The proximity to death becomes ordinary, unremarkable. You grow accustomed to waking up and discovering that the person who slept 3 mats away has not survived the night. You become inured to the sounds of sickness, the sight of suffering, This emotional numbing is perhaps a necessary adaptation to the harsh realities of poorhouse life, but it comes at a cost to your humanity, to your capacity for hope and feeling. Living in the poorhouse changes you in ways that go beyond the physical. The constant supervision, the rigid routine, the lack of any privacy or personal autonomy, these conditions reshape your sense of self. You learn to be passive, to wait for instructions, to never initiate anything without permission. You learn to suppress your desires and opinions, to keep your head down and avoid notice. These are survival strategies in an environment where any display of individuality or resistance can result in punishment, but they are also deeply dehumanizing. The monotony of the days begins to blur together. With no variation in routine, no personal possessions to mark your space, no control over even the most basic aspects of your existence, you begin to lose your sense of identity. You are not a unique individual with a personal history and future prospects. You are simply another pauper, interchangeable with all the others who share your dormitory. Some inmates find ways to resist this psychological dissolution. They hold on to memories of their former lives, telling and retelling their stories to anyone who will listen, using narrative as a way to maintain their sense of self. They form friendships with other inmates, creating small networks of mutual support that help everyone involved retain some measure of humanity. They engage in minor acts of rebellion, working slightly more slowly than required, sharing food despite rules against it, whispering after lights out, small assertions of autonomy in a system designed to eliminate it. Others succumb to what we might now call institutionalization. They adapt so completely to poorhouse life that they become unable to function outside it. The world beyond the walls begins to seem foreign and frightening. The responsibilities of independence, finding work, securing housing, managing money, become overwhelming. For these individuals, the poorhouse becomes, paradoxically, a kind of refuge, the only environment in which they know how to survive. When they are discharged, they often find themselves back at the poorhouse gates within weeks or months, unable to make a life on the outside. Occasionally, the routine of poorhouse life is interrupted by visitors from outside. Sometimes, these are parish officials conducting inspections, ensuring that the overseer is managing the institution properly and that the parish's money is being spent appropriately. These visits prompt a flurry of cleaning and organizing, a temporary improvement in conditions that evaporates as soon as the officials depart. Other times, visitors come from charitable motives. Local gentlewomen might visit to distribute small gifts to the inmates, perhaps knitted goods or small amounts of food. These gestures are well-intentioned, but also serve to reinforce the social hierarchy, reminding paupers of their dependence on the benevolence of their betters. You are expected to receive these gifts with appropriate displays of gratitude and deference, bowing or curtsying to your benefactors and thanking them profusely for their kindness. Clergymen visit periodically to deliver sermons or conduct religious services. These visits provide a break in routine, but also bring their own burdens, as the clergy often use the captive audience to deliver lengthy homilies on moral improvement and the acceptance of suffering as God's will. You sit or stand through these services, your mind wandering when you will be permitted to return to the relative peace of the workroom. In the quiet moments, in the brief intervals between sleep and waking, or during the endless hours of oakum picking, your mind turns to thoughts of escape. Not necessarily physical escape. The poorhouse is not a prison, and technically you can request to leave at any time, but escape into a better life, a return to independence and dignity. You think about what it would take to get out and stay out. You would need to find work. But what work could you do with hands ruined by oakum picking and a reputation tainted by pauperism? You would need a place to live, but who would rent to you? You would need to eat while you searched for employment, but you have no savings, no resources to draw upon. The mathematics of poverty are brutally simple. The poorhouse is easier to enter than to leave, and those who do manage to leave often find themselves returning when the next crisis strikes. Still, you allow yourself to dream. Perhaps there will be a seasonal demand for labor, harvest time, when even paupers might find a few weeks of work in the fields. Perhaps a distant relative you've never met will die and leave you a small inheritance. Perhaps the economy will improve, wages will rise, and opportunities will expand. These dreams are fragile things, easily crushed by the daily realities of institutional life, but they are also necessary small candles of hope in a very dark place. Finally, after the evening's moral instruction, after the last bell has rung, you are permitted to return to the dormitory. You make your way through the dim corridors. Rushlights provide minimal illumination, and find your sleeping mat. The dormitory is cold. There are few blankets, and those provided are thin and inadequate. You lie down in your institutional clothing, pulling the blanket up to your chin, listening to the sounds of others settling in around you. The old man begins his nightly coughing. A child somewhere cries quietly, quickly shushed by a mother who knows that loud disturbances will bring the overseer and his punishments. Someone prays in a whisper. Someone else sighs heavily, the sound full of resignation and sorrow. You close your eyes and wait for sleep to come. Your fingers throb from the day's labor. Your stomach is not quite full enough to be comfortable. Your mind churns with worry about tomorrow, and the day after, and all the uncertain days stretching ahead. But eventually, mercifully, exhaustion wins out over anxiety, and you drift into unconsciousness, into dreams that take you far from the poorhouse, back to a time when you were not a pauper, but a person, when your life was your own, and the future seemed to hold possibility rather than merely more of the same grinding sameness. This is the daily life of the Tudor poorhouse, a life defined by monotony, hardship, and stigma, a life that thousands of England's poorest inhabitants endured during the 16th century. It was a system created ostensibly to help those in need, but designed in practice to punish poverty and discourage dependency, reflecting the Tudor conviction that want was a moral failing rather than an economic circumstance. But how did England arrive at this particular solution to the problem of poverty? What forces created the massive population of destitute people who would fill these institutions? To understand that, we must step back and examine a transformative event in Tudor history, one that reshaped not only the physical landscape of England, but also its social and economic fabric. Let us turn now to the story of the dissolution of the monasteries, and to the man whose policies would inadvertently create the conditions that made the poorhouse necessary. To understand how England arrived at the poorhouse, we must travel back to the early decades of the 16th century, to an England that looked and functioned very differently from the one we left in the previous segment. This is an England still thoroughly Catholic, still woven through with the physical and social infrastructure of monasticism, still operating under assumptions about charity and social welfare that had held for centuries. Imagine the English countryside in the year 1530, 5 years before the crisis that would change everything. The landscape is dotted with religious houses, monasteries, abbeys, priories, friaries, nunneries, institutions that have stood for hundreds of years, some since the Norman conquest and earlier. There are approximately 850 of these establishments spread across England and Wales, ranging from tiny priories with just a handful of monks to vast abbey complexes like Glastonbury or Fountains, which function almost as small towns unto themselves. These religious houses are not merely places of prayer and contemplation, though they are certainly that. They are also economic engines, landowners, employers, and the primary providers of what we would now call social services. They run schools for local children. They maintain hospitals and infirmaries. They provide hospitality to travelers, offering food and shelter to anyone who arrives at their gates. And crucially, they dispense charity to the poor, distributing alms daily, feeding the hungry and supporting those unable to support themselves. The monasteries own vast tracts of land. Estimates suggest that religious houses control somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all cultivated land in England. This land is worked by tenant farmers who pay rent to the monastery, creating a traditional feudal relationship that provides both parties with a measure of security. The tenant has access to land and knows what is expected of him. The monastery has a steady income and a stable population of workers. It is not an equal relationship, the power imbalance is stark, but it is a stable one, governed by custom and mutual obligation. Now let us turn our attention to the man who will unravel all of this, not because he sets out to create social chaos, but because he is focused on other, more personal concerns. Henry VIII is, in 1530, a king of 40 years, married for 21 years to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess 6 years his senior. The marriage has produced only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. Henry wants a son, needs a son, believes that without a male heir, his dynasty will collapse into civil war the moment he dies, as rival claimants battle for the throne. He has convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine is cursed by God, pointing to a passage in Leviticus that forbids a man from marrying his brother's widow. Catherine was briefly married to Henry's older brother Arthur before Arthur's death, and though both Catherine and the Church insist that marriage was never consummated, Henry now seizes upon this detail as evidence that his union is unlawful in the eyes of God. He wants an annulment, permission to set Catherine aside and marry again, preferably to Anne Boleyn, a young woman of the court with whom he has become obsessed. Under normal circumstances, this would be a matter to be resolved by the Pope in Rome. Popes had granted annulments before to powerful monarchs for far flimsier reasons. But these are not normal circumstances. Catherine of Aragon is the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who currently controls much of Europe, including the Papal States. Charles does not want his aunt humiliated and set aside. The Pope, caught between a powerful emperor and a distant king, delays, equivocates, and ultimately refuses to grant the annulment Henry seeks. Henry's response to this impasse will reshape English history. If the Pope will not grant him what he wants, then he will remove the Pope's authority over England entirely. He will make himself, not the Bishop of Rome, the supreme head of the Church in England. And once he has done that, he will grant himself the annulment that the Pope denied him. The break with Rome unfolds gradually over several years in the early 1530s, a series of parliamentary acts that incrementally transfer power from the Pope to the Crown. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 formally declares Henry to be the supreme head of the Church of England, a breathtaking assertion of royal power that overturns 1,000 years of Christian tradition. It is not, initially, a Protestant Reformation in theological terms. Henry remains largely Catholic in doctrine and practice, but it is a revolution in ecclesiastical governance, placing the English Church under royal rather than papal control. This political revolution creates both opportunities and problems for Henry. The opportunity is obvious. He can now arrange his domestic affairs as he wishes, setting aside Catherine and marrying Anne Boleyn, which he does in 1533. The problem is equally obvious. His break with Rome has made him enemies, both foreign and domestic. The Pope has excommunicated him. Catholic powers in Europe view him as a heretic and schismatic. Within England, there are many who remain loyal to the old faith and the old order, who view Henry's actions as sacrilegious and his new marriage as invalid. Henry needs to consolidate his position. He needs to demonstrate that he is firmly in control, that resistance is futile. He needs to reward his supporters and cow his opponents. And perhaps most pressingly, he needs money. The royal treasury is perpetually strained. His father, Henry VII, had left him a full treasury, but decades of expensive wars and even more expensive pageantry have depleted it. Breaking with Rome has cut off the flow of money that used to go from England to the papal coffers. But that redirection of funds is not nearly enough to meet Henry's needs. Enter Thomas Cromwell, one of the most remarkable figures of the Tudor age, a man of relatively humble origins, who has risen to become Henry's chief minister through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and an instinctive understanding of how power operates. Cromwell is the architect of the dissolution of the monasteries, the administrative genius who will transform Henry's vague desires into concrete policy and systematic action. Cromwell understands that to seize the monastery's wealth, Henry needs a justification that will satisfy at least some of his subjects. He cannot simply declare that he is confiscating church property because he wants the money. That would be too nakedly tyrannical. Instead, Cromwell creates a narrative of monastic corruption and decay, a story in which the dissolution of the monasteries becomes not an act of greed, but a work of righteous reform. In 1535, Cromwell commissions a survey of all religious houses in England and Wales, an administrative undertaking of remarkable scope and efficiency. Teams of commissioners are dispatched to every monastery, tasked with assessing the wealth of each institution and, more importantly, with documenting evidence of corruption, immorality, or deviation from proper monastic practice. The commissioners are not neutral observers. They are working for Cromwell, and they know what kind of evidence he wants them to find. The reports they produce paint a damning picture of monastic life. Monks are described as lazy, gluttonous, and unchaste. Abbots are accused of embezzlement and living in inappropriate luxury. Religious observance is reported as lax and insincere. Some of these accusations are undoubtedly true. Monasticism in the early 16th century had its share of genuine problems, as any human institution does over time. But the reports are also selective and exaggerated, highlighting every failing while ignoring the many monasteries that continue to function effectively and serve their communities faithfully. Armed with these reports, Cromwell moves to the next phase of his plan. In 1536, Parliament passes the Act for the Dissolution of the Lesser Monasteries, targeting religious houses with an annual income of less than £200. The justification is that these smaller, poorer houses are the most corrupt and therefore the most in need of dissolution. Their assets, land, buildings, gold and silver plate, livestock, everything, are to be transferred to the crown. The monks and nuns are offered three choices. They can transfer to larger monasteries that remain open, they can renounce their vows and return to secular life with a small pension, or they can resist and face the consequences of treason. The dissolution of the lesser monasteries proceeds with mechanical efficiency. Royal commissioners arrive at each targeted house with soldiers to enforce compliance. The monks or nuns are assembled and informed of the decision. Inventories are taken of all possessions. Valuable items are removed for the crown. Buildings are assessed for their potential uses. Some can be converted to other purposes, others are to be demolished and their materials sold. The process is designed to move quickly, before organized resistance can form. Imagine yourself as a monk in one of these smaller houses, perhaps a priory in Yorkshire with a community of 15 brothers. You have lived here for 20 years, having entered as a young man seeking a life of prayer and stability. The priory is not wealthy, but it has been your home, your family, your entire world. You know every stone of its chapel, every tree in its orchard, every face in the surrounding villages where the priory distributes alms each week. The commissioners arrive on a grey morning in early spring. They are accompanied by armed men, though there is no resistance to put down. Where would you run, and how would you live? The lead commissioner reads the act of dissolution aloud in the chapter house. Your abbot argues, pleads, points out the charitable work the priory does, but his words fall on deaf ears. The commissioners have their orders and dozens of other houses to visit. You are given a choice. Transfer to a larger monastery or accept a pension and leave. The pension amounts to perhaps £3 or £4 per year, barely enough to live on and dependent on the Crown's continued willingness to pay it. Some of your brothers choose to transfer, hoping to preserve their religious vocation. Others, particularly the older monks, accept the pension and prepare to return to families and villages they have not seen in decades. You watch as the priory is systematically emptied. The silver plate from the chapel is packed into chests. The lead is stripped from the roof. The bells are taken down from the tower. Local people are already gathering, knowing that soon they will be able to purchase building materials at cut-rate prices as the structure is dismantled. Within a month, the priory that stood for 300 years is gone. Some of the stone will be used by local farmers to build walls and barns. Some will be carted away to construct a manor house for a gentleman who has purchased the priory's lands from the Crown. The chapel, stripped of everything valuable, is left to the weather, its windows empty, its altar bare, a hollow shell that will gradually crumble over the coming decades. This scene repeats itself hundreds of times across England between 1536 and 1538, as the lesser monasteries are systematically closed. Approximately 300 houses are dissolved in this first wave, displacing several thousand monks, nuns, and the lay servants who worked for them. The dissolution of the lesser monasteries triggers the most serious rebellion of Henry VIII's reign. In the autumn of 1536, a popular uprising begins in Lincolnshire and spreads rapidly across the north of England. Known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, it unites various grievances, religious, economic, and political, into a movement that, at its peak, fields an army of perhaps 30,000 men. The rebels have many complaints. They oppose the religious changes Henry has imposed. They resent the new taxes Cromwell has levied. They fear that the dissolution will destroy the social fabric of their communities. Many monasteries in the north were major employers and providers of charity. Their closure means immediate hardship for the surrounding population. The rebels demand the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of Cromwell and other reformist advisors, and a return to traditional religious practices. The rebellion is large and well organized enough to pose a genuine threat to Henry's rule. For several weeks, the outcome hangs in the balance. The rebel army could march on London if it chooses. But Henry, advised by the Duke of Norfolk, responds with a combination of deceit and force. He promises to consider the rebels' grievances and grants a general pardon if they will disperse. The rebel leaders, trusting in the king's word, stand down their forces. It is a fatal mistake. Once the rebel army has dispersed, Henry moves to exact vengeance. The ringleaders are arrested and executed, many of them in deliberately brutal public displays designed to terrorize the population into submission. The abbot of one northern monastery that supported the rebellion is hanged in chains from his own abbey tower. Approximately 200 rebels are put to death, their bodies displayed as warnings. The message is clear. Resistance to the Crown's religious policies will be met with overwhelming force. The Pilgrimage of Grace accomplishes the opposite of its intention. Rather than slowing the dissolution, it convinces Henry and Cromwell that the monasteries are dangerous sources of potential opposition that must be eliminated entirely. The rebellion provides a pretext for extending the dissolution to include the larger, wealthier houses that the original act had left untouched. Between 1538 and 1540, the remaining monasteries are closed. This time, there is no need for parliamentary legislation. The larger houses are pressured or coerced into voluntarily surrendering themselves to the Crown. Abbots are visited by royal commissioners and made to understand that cooperation will be rewarded with pensions and perhaps minor positions in the new order, while resistance will be treated as treason. The great abbeys of England fall one by one. Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, with its vast estates and hundreds of dependents, is dissolved in 1539. Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, one of the richest and most ancient houses in England, is closed the same year after its abbot is executed for refusing to surrender voluntarily. His head is later displayed on the Abbey gate as a warning to others. Reading Abbey, St Albans Abbey, Bury St Edmunds, Westminster Abbey itself, all are stripped of their wealth and dissolved. By 1540, not a single monastery remains functioning in England. The scale of wealth transferred from the church to the crown is staggering. Land that generated annual revenues equivalent to perhaps a third of the crown's income now belongs to Henry. Gold and silver plate, precious vestments, jeweled reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts, all are seized. Much of the precious metal is melted down to replenish the royal treasury. Some of the land is kept as crown property, but much of it is sold to raise immediate cash, creating a new class of landowners enriched by the spoliation of the church. These new owners have different priorities than the monasteries did. Monastic landlords, for all their faults, operated within a framework of Christian charity and traditional obligation. The new landlords are entrepreneurs, interested primarily in maximizing the return on their investment. They enclose common lands that villagers depended on for grazing. They raise rents to market rates, displacing tenants who cannot pay. They convert arable land to sheep pasture, which requires fewer workers but produces more profitable wool, throwing agricultural laborers out of work. What happens to the religious men and women displaced by the dissolution? The answer varies depending on age, health, connections, and simple luck. Some former monks successfully transition to new roles as parish priests. The Church of England still needs clergy, and educated men with experience are in demand. These former religious retain some of their old status and find a measure of security in their new positions, though they must now navigate the complexities of serving a state church rather than an international religious order. Others are less fortunate. Elderly monks who accept their pensions find that the promised payments are irregular or insufficient. They cannot return to labor. Their years in the monastery have left them unfit for physical work. They cannot easily reintegrate into communities they left decades ago. Many become wanderers, part of the growing population of masterless men who move from place to place, seeking charity or work. The nuns face particular hardships. A monk might become a parish priest, but there is no equivalent role for women in the Reformed Church. Former nuns are expected to return to their families, but many no longer have families willing or able to take them in. Some marry, though marriageable women past their youth and without dowries are not much sought after. Others survive on charity or pensions. Some undoubtedly fall into destitution. The lay servants who worked for the monasteries, the cooks, grooms, gardeners, craftsmen, and general laborers who kept the great houses functioning, number in the thousands, and they receive no pensions, no compensation beyond perhaps a final wage payment. They are simply turned out to find new employment in an economy that is not prepared to absorb them. But perhaps the most devastating impact of the dissolution is the elimination of the monastic charitable infrastructure. Every day, at the gates of hundreds of monasteries across England, the poor had gathered to receive alms. A daily distribution of bread, sometimes ale or cheese, sometimes small coins. These donations were not generous, but they were reliable, and for many of the poorest, they made the difference between survival and starvation. The dissolution eliminates this support virtually overnight. The new owners of former monastic lands have no interest in continuing charitable distributions. Why would they? The new landlords are not bound by religious vows of charity. They are businessmen and gentlemen concerned with profit and status, not with the welfare of the vagrant poor. Estimates of how many people were dependent on monastic charity vary, but historians suggest the number might have been as high as 10,000 receiving regular support, with many more receiving occasional assistance. When that support vanishes, Those 10,000 people do not simply vanish with it, they become wanderers, beggars, part of a growing crisis of vagrancy that will preoccupy the Tudor state for the rest of the century. The dissolution also closes monastic hospitals and infirmaries. In an age without a health service, these institutions provided the only medical care available to many of the poor. Their closure means that the sick who cannot afford a physician have nowhere to turn. Some parish churches try to fill the gap, but they lack the resources and expertise of the former monastic institutions. The economic effects of the dissolution ripple outward in ways that Cromwell and Henry do not anticipate, or, if they do anticipate them, do not care about. The monasteries were major purchasers of goods and services. They bought food from local farmers, cloth from local weavers, candles from chandlers, and so forth. They employed builders, smiths, and craftsmen for maintenance and repairs. All of this economic activity disappears when the monasteries close. The enclosure of former monastic lands compounds the problem. When common land is enclosed and converted to sheep pasture, entire villages can be displaced. Arable farming is labor-intensive, sheep farming is not. A field that once employed 20 families might now require only a shepherd and a few helpers. The displaced families must either find new land to work, increasingly difficult as enclosure spreads, or abandon agriculture entirely and seek work in towns. The result is a growing population of dispossessed, landless people with no stable means of support. Some find work as day laborers, hired by the day during busy seasons and unemployed the rest of the year. Others turn to begging or petty crime. Some become part of a wandering underclass, moving from place to place in search of opportunities that rarely materialize. Women in particularly desperate circumstances might turn to prostitution, the only trade readily available to those without resources or skills. Tudor authorities view this growing population of mobile poor with deep suspicion. They see not victims of economic disruption, but potential criminals, idlers who refuse to work, threats to social order. This perception will shape the harsh poor laws that Parliament enacts in the decades following the dissolution, laws designed to control and punish the poor rather than to address the economic causes of poverty. The dissolution provides Henry with an enormous windfall, but he manages to squander it with remarkable speed. Much of the money goes to fund wars with France and Scotland, expensive, indecisive conflicts that achieve little beyond the loss of English lives and treasure. Some goes to building new palaces and fortifications. Some goes to rewarding loyal supporters with gifts of land and positions. By the time Henry dies in 1547, grossly overweight and in considerable pain from various ailments, the monastic windfall is mostly gone. His son, Edward VI, inherits a throne that is arguably less financially secure than it was before the dissolution, but he also inherits an England fundamentally transformed. The physical landscape has changed. Ruined abbeys dot the countryside, their stones carried off to build farmhouses and manors. The social landscape has changed even more dramatically. The old certainties of Catholic England are gone, replaced by religious division and uncertainty, and the economic landscape has changed most drastically of all, with a greatly enlarged population of poor people and no clear system for supporting them. The poorhouse we explored in the first segment is, in many ways, a direct consequence of Henry's policies. When the monasteries disappeared, they took with them the medieval system of charity that had, however imperfectly, provided a safety net for the destitute. The Tudor state eventually develops a new system based on parish responsibility for the poor, funded by compulsory local taxation, the poor rates, and administered through institutions like workhouses and poorhouses. But this new system is designed more to control the poor than to help them, reflecting the Tudor conviction that poverty is a moral failing rather than an economic condition. There is a bitter irony in all of this. Henry VIII breaks with Rome not for any grand theological principle. He remains largely orthodox in his Catholic beliefs throughout his life, but for the personal matter of his marriage and his desire for a male heir. The dissolution of the monasteries, justified initially as a reform of corrupt institutions, becomes instead a massive transfer of wealth from the church to the crown, and then from the crown to a new class of landowners. The reformers who support Henry's break with Rome often do so because they genuinely believe in Protestant theology and want to purify the church of what they see as Catholic superstition and corruption. But the practical result of the dissolution is not a purer church, but a more ruthless economy. The land that once supported communities of monks now enriches individual gentlemen. The charity that once flowed reliably to the poor now depends on the whims of parish overseers and the grudging contributions of ratepayers who resent having to support those they view as idle. Henry gets his break from Rome and his ability to marry whom he chooses, though his marital adventures after Anne Boleyn bring him little happiness. He gets the glory of having reshaped England's religious identity. He gets the wealth of the monasteries, however briefly. But the unintended consequences of his actions will haunt England for generations. The poorhouse, with its oakum picking and its thin gruel, with its separation of families and its atmosphere of shame and punishment, is part of Henry's legacy, as surely as Hampton Court Palace or the English Reformation itself. By 1540, the England that existed in 1530 is gone. Dissolved as thoroughly as the monasteries themselves, it is a land of empty ruins and enclosed fields, of displaced families and overstretched parishes, of religious uncertainty and economic anxiety. The bonds of traditional society, the obligations of lords to tenants, of monasteries to the poor, of church to congregation, have been loosened or broken entirely, replaced by market relationships and state bureaucracy. This transformation is not entirely negative. The dissolution does eliminate some genuine corruption. It does break the power of the church as a political rival to the crown. It does create new opportunities for some, the purchasers of monastic land, the merchants who grow rich from the wool trade, the gentry who consolidate their power. England is modernizing, becoming more centralized, more efficient, more commercially oriented. But modernization comes at a human cost. The men and women picking oakum in the poorhouses of Elizabethan England are, many of them, the human debris of Henry's policies. They are the former tenants of enclosed monastic estates. They are the children of craftsmen who lost their livelihoods when the monasteries closed. They are the elderly who once received monastic alms and now must throw themselves on parish charity. They are the nurses and servants who worked in monastic hospitals and now have no work at all. Their suffering is the price of the transformation Henry set in motion. Their lives, lived out in the grim confines of poorhouses and workhouses, are a reminder that great historical changes, even those justified as reforms or modernizations, often fall most heavily on those least able to bear them. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind rest on this historical irony, that a king's desire for a son and his willingness to overturn centuries of tradition to get one could result in the poorhouse dormitory, the oakum room, the watery gruel, the separation of families. History is made by great men making great decisions, but it is lived by ordinary people dealing with the consequences of those decisions, trying to survive in a world transformed without their consent and often against their interests. The bells of the dissolved monasteries have long since fallen silent. The monks have dispersed. The buildings have crumbled or been converted to other uses. But the poor remain, and the institutions created to manage them. Harsh, punitive, designed more to discourage than to help. Those institutions will endure for centuries, evolving but never entirely disappearing, a testament to the lasting impact of decisions made in the 1530s by a king who never imagined the full consequences of his actions. History, as it is traditionally written, tends to focus on those who left abundant records: the monarchs and nobles, the wealthy merchants and learned clerics, those whose lives were documented in letters, account books, and official chronicles. The poor, by contrast, lived and died largely unrecorded. They signed no contracts because they owned nothing to contract about. They wrote no letters because many were illiterate, and even if they could write, to whom would they write and about what? They appear in official records only as problems to be managed, names in poor relief accounts or court records of vagrancy. But the poor did leave evidence of their existence. They left their bodies buried in parish graveyards and poorhouse cemeteries. They left the physical traces of their daily lives, the worn floors they walked upon, the tools they used, the buildings that confined them. And they left just enough documentary traces that patient scholars, piecing together fragments from parish records and institutional accounts, can begin to reconstruct something of their experiences. In this segment, we turn our attention to these traces, to the work of archaeologists and historians who have excavated poorhouse sites and pored over dusty ledgers, bringing to light the forgotten lives of Tudor England's most marginal inhabitants. Let us descend into the quiet work of discovery, into burial grounds and archives, where the past speaks in whispers that require careful listening to discern. Imagine a plot of ground on the edge of a parish, perhaps a quarter-acre in size, bordered by a low stone wall. This is the poorhouse cemetery, the final resting place for those who died within the institution. Unlike the main parish churchyard, with its carved headstones marking the graves of respectable citizens, this ground is largely unmarked. There may be a few wooden markers, but wood rots and names fade. Most graves are indicated only by slight depressions in the earth, if they are indicated at all. In recent decades, some of these burial grounds have been excavated by archaeologists, often as part of modern development projects that require the remains to be moved before construction can proceed. These excavations provide a unique window into the lives and deaths of the Tudor poor, revealing details that no written record could capture. Poorhouse burials, by contrast, often show signs of mass interment and minimal ceremony. Multiple bodies might be placed in a single large grave pit, stacked in layers. Coffins are rare. Many bodies were simply wrapped in shrouds, or in some cases, nothing at all. The positioning of bodies is sometimes irregular, suggesting that grave diggers were more concerned with efficiency than with strict religious observance. The message in these burial practices is clear. Even in death, paupers were treated differently, afforded less dignity, given less care than their more fortunate neighbors. When archaeologists examine skeletal remains from poorhouse cemeteries, they can read in the bones themselves a detailed story of hardship and suffering. The science of osteoarchaeology, the study of ancient bones, has become increasingly sophisticated, allowing researchers to determine not just age and sex, but also health status, diet, occupation, and even, in some cases, specific events in an individual's life. The bones of poorhouse inmates show characteristic patterns of stress and deprivation. Many skeletons display evidence of malnutrition, particularly in the form of Harris lines, horizontal lines visible in X-rays of long bones, marking periods when growth was interrupted by inadequate nutrition. In a well-nourished population, Harris lines might appear once or twice in childhood, marking periods of illness. In poorhouse populations, they often appear multiple times, creating a striped pattern in the bone that speaks of repeated episodes of near starvation throughout life. Dental evidence tells a similar story. Teeth from poorhouse burials frequently show enamel hypoplasia, defects in the tooth enamel caused by malnutrition or disease during the years when teeth are forming. The poor quality of the poorhouse diet, with its emphasis on carbohydrates and lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, leads to dental decay and gum disease. By middle age, many inmates would have lost most of their teeth, making it even more difficult to eat the tough, coarse food provided by the institution. The bones also reveal the toll of hard labor. Skeletons of adult males from poorhouse contexts often show degenerative changes in the spine and joints, particularly in the lower back, shoulders, and hands. The characteristic wear pattern of heavy manual labor over many years. The oakum picking we discussed in segment 1 leaves its mark. Enlarged finger joints, arthritic changes, and sometimes small fragments of rope fiber still embedded in the bone where injuries became infected. Women's skeletons show different but equally telling patterns, with damage to the spine and hips consistent with repeated childbearing combined with poor nutrition and hard work. One of the most striking findings from poorhouse cemetery excavations is how young many of the deceased were. While some elderly individuals are present, those who manage to survive to old age despite a lifetime of poverty, a significant proportion of the burials are of children and young adults. Infant and child mortality was high in Tudor England generally, but it was even higher among the poor. Babies born in the poorhouse or brought there by destitute mothers faced daunting odds. Inadequate nutrition for pregnant and nursing mothers meant underweight babies with weakened immune systems. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of the institution promoted the spread of infectious diseases. The separation of mothers from babies for much of the day, mothers had to work, and infants were often cared for communally, disrupted breastfeeding and maternal bonding. The result was that many infants died in their first year, their tiny bodies buried in the poorhouse cemetery with minimal ceremony. Children who survived infancy still faced significant risks. Epidemic diseases swept through poorhouse populations regularly. Typhus, spread by lice in the crowded dormitories. Dysentery, from contaminated water or food. Influenza, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, all found easy prey among malnourished, immune-compromised children living in close quarters. Some excavations have revealed clusters of child burials that likely represent epidemic events, moments when disease ripped through the institution's juvenile population in a matter of weeks. Young adults, too, are disproportionately represented in poorhouse cemeteries. These are people in their 20s and 30s who should have been in the prime of life, but who instead succumbed to the combined effects of poverty, malnutrition, and disease. Some show evidence of acute illnesses, pneumonia perhaps, or septicemia from an infected wound. Others show the slower progression of chronic conditions like tuberculosis, their bones displaying the characteristic lesions of advanced infection. Individual stories written in bone. Occasionally, a skeleton tells a story specific enough that we can imagine the individual behind it. Consider a burial excavated from a poorhouse cemetery in Norfolk in the 1990s. A woman in her early 20s, buried in a simple shroud with no accompanying goods. Analysis of her skeleton revealed multiple fractures in various stages of healing. A broken arm that had healed poorly, several cracked ribs, fractures in the bones of her face. These injuries occurred at different times over several years, suggesting not a single accident but repeated trauma, most likely domestic violence. Her teeth showed severe decay and abscesses, which would have caused constant pain. Her spine displayed compression fractures consistent with carrying heavy loads while malnourished. Chemical analysis of her bones revealed that her diet in the final years of her life consisted primarily of grains and legumes with very little meat or dairy. And her burial itself, in the poorhouse cemetery, in an unmarked grave, tells us that she died without family or resources, that whatever series of misfortunes brought her to this end included not just poverty, but complete social isolation. We do not know her name. We do not know whether she grew up poor or fell into poverty. We do not know what circumstances led to the violence she suffered, or how she ended up in the poorhouse, or what finally killed her. But we know she existed. We know she suffered. We know that her short life was marked by pain and hardship, and that she died among strangers in an institution designed more to punish than to help. Her skeleton, preserved in the earth for 400 years, speaks on behalf of the countless others whose stories were never written down. While archaeological evidence provides physical proof of poorhouse life, documentary records offer a different kind of detail: names, dates, and sometimes brief glimpses into circumstances. Parish records from the Tudor period, particularly from the later 16th century onward, contain scattered references to the poor and to poorhouse operations. Parish registers, which record baptisms, marriages and burials, occasionally note when an individual is a pauper. A burial entry might read simply, "John Smith Pauper, buried 23rd of March 1587. Sometimes there is slightly more detail. Mary Green, widow of the poorhouse, buried 15 July 1592, age unknown. These terse entries are all that remains of individual lives, single lines in a register book that might run to hundreds of pages covering decades of parish history. Church wardens' accounts provide more systematic information about poor relief. These account books track the parish's financial management, including expenditures on the poor. We can see payments made to paupers for specific needs. Paid to widow Thompson for her rent, 4 shillings. Given to Thomas Wright, being lame, 2 pence. Paid for a shroud for the child that died in the poorhouse, 6 pence. Each line represents a small transaction, a moment when the parish's resources were deployed to address an individual need. One particularly revealing class of documents consists of settlement certificates and removal orders. Tudor poor law operated on the principle that each parish was responsible only for its own poor. Those who were born in the parish or who had gained a legal settlement there through residence, work or marriage. Strangers who sought poor relief could be legally removed and sent back to their parish of origin. Settlement certificates were documents issued by a parish confirming that an individual belonged there and that the parish would accept responsibility for them if they became destitute elsewhere. These certificates were necessary for anyone who wanted to travel or seek work outside their home parish. Without such documentation, a poor person risked being arrested as a vagrant and forcibly returned to where they came from. Removal orders document cases where parishes did send poor people away. These records often provide brief narratives of how individuals became destitute and how they ended up in the wrong parish. For example, Margaret Hudson, widow with 2 children, found begging in this parish. She claims to have been born in the parish of St. Mary's, Essex, where her husband was a labourer until his death. She is to be conveyed back to Essex at the parish's expense. Reading through these records, patterns emerge. Many of those being removed are women, widows who left their home parishes following their husbands in search of work, only to become destitute when their husbands died. Others are seasonal labourers who travelled for harvest work and then found themselves stranded when work ended. Some are people fleeing from debts or bad situations, hoping to start fresh in a new place but lacking the resources to do so legally. These documents reveal how the Tudor poor law, ostensibly designed to provide a safety net, could instead trap people in poverty. If you were born in a parish with few opportunities, you were legally bound to that parish for purposes of poor relief. If you tried to better your circumstances by seeking work elsewhere and then fell on hard times, you could be forcibly returned to where you started. The system thus discouraged mobility and enterprise among the poor, keeping them geographically and economically fixed. Some larger poorhouses and later workhouses kept detailed admission records, though relatively few of these survive from the Tudor period itself. Where they do exist, they provide invaluable information about who entered these institutions and why. A typical admission record might note the name of the inmate, their age, their place of origin, their marital status, any children accompanying them, and a brief statement of their circumstances. For example, Thomas Baker, age 47, from this parish, formerly a weaver, admitted due to injury to his hand making him unable to work, wife deceased, no children. Or Anne Johnson, age 28, widow with 3 children ages 6, 4 and 1 year, admitted after eviction from her cottage. Husband died of fever 6 months past. These records allow historians to build statistical profiles of poorhouse populations. We can see, for instance, that widows with young children were a significant proportion of admissions. Not surprising, given that a woman's economic status was often entirely dependent on her husband's earnings. We can see that craftsmen and laborers who suffered injuries or illness that prevented them from working formed another large category. We can see seasonal patterns, with more admissions during winter months when work was scarce and survival more difficult. The records also sometimes note the outcome, whether the inmate died in the poorhouse, was discharged when they found work, or ran away. These outcomes tell their own stories. Death rates in poorhouses were high, particularly for the very young and very old. Discharge rates varied with economic conditions. In times of labor shortage, able-bodied inmates might find work relatively quickly, while in times of recession, they might remain in the institution for months or years. Escape, though risky, it could result in punishment if caught, was not uncommon, suggesting that conditions inside were often worse than the uncertainty of life outside. When a pauper died in the poorhouse, their possessions, such as they were typically inventoried before being recycled back into the institution or sold to raise a few pennies for the parish. These post-mortem inventories, brief as they are, provide poignant evidence of how little the poor owned. A typical inventory might list 1 woolen shift worn, 1 pair of stockings darned, 1 cap, total value estimated at 8 pence. Or even more minimally, nothing but the clothes on her back. These lists stand in stark contrast to the inventories of even moderately prosperous individuals, which might run to pages and include detailed descriptions of furniture, clothing, household goods, tools, and other possessions. The inventories remind us that poverty in Tudor England meant not just lack of money, but lack of things. No spare clothing, no personal treasures, no tools of trade, no books, no furniture, nothing to pass on to children or to remember the dead by. The material culture of poverty is a culture of absence, of possessions worn down to nothing through use, of spaces empty of the objects that give comfort and meaning to life. Very rarely we encounter actual voices of the poor themselves, preserved in letters or petitions to authorities requesting help. These documents are exceptional because they require literacy and the resources to produce and deliver a written document, which puts them beyond the reach of most paupers. But occasionally, someone literate enough to write or wealthy enough to pay a scribe would set down their circumstances in a formal petition. These petitions follow formulaic patterns, but within the formulas, individual desperation breaks through. A petition might begin, "To the worshipful masters of the parish of St. Andrew, the humble petition of Elizabeth Wood, widow, most humbly showeth," and then proceed to detail the petitioner's circumstances and request. The language is formal and deferential. Petitioners understand that their chance of receiving help depends on presenting themselves as properly humble and deserving, but the content is often heartbreaking. One surviving petition from the 1570s, for instance, describes a widow whose husband died of plague, leaving her with 4 children. She had tried to support them through spinning, but could not earn enough. One child had died of hunger-related illness. She was facing eviction from her 1-room dwelling. She begged the parish to grant her a small weekly allowance so she could keep her remaining children alive and together. Whether her petition was successful, we do not know. The document survives without any notation of the parish's response. These letters remind us that behind the statistics and the archaeological evidence were real people, making desperate calculations about survival, trying to navigate a system that was often arbitrary and always insufficient to actual need. They wrote or dictated these petitions, knowing they were asking for charity from their social superiors, knowing that the help, if it came at all, would be grudging and minimal, knowing that their poverty marked them as failures in the eyes of their society. And still they wrote because the alternative, watching their children starve, was unthinkable. Another category of records that occasionally illuminates the lives of the poor consists of coroner's inquests, investigations into sudden or suspicious deaths. When someone died violently or under unclear circumstances, the coroner was required to investigate and produce a report. These reports sometimes document deaths of paupers under conditions that reveal the dangers they faced. An inquest from 1585, for instance, describes the death of a poorhouse inmate who was struck by a cart while begging on a busy road. Another records the death of a child who wandered away from the poorhouse and drowned in a nearby river. Others document deaths from workplace accidents. A man crushed when a wall he was demolishing collapsed. A woman burned when her clothing caught fire while she was working near an open flame. Some inquests reveal even darker stories. A record from 1590 describes the death of a poorhouse inmate who appears to have been beaten by the overseer as punishment for some infraction. The inquest carefully avoids explicitly blaming the overseer, instead suggesting the death resulted from the deceased's own weakness and ill health. But the evidence of recent bruising and the testimony of other inmates point to a different conclusion. Such cases remind us that the power imbalance in poorhouses created opportunities for abuse, and that inmates had little recourse when authority figures mistreated them. Beyond the cemetery excavations, archaeology has occasionally uncovered the physical remains of poorhouse buildings and the artifacts associated with them. These excavations reveal the material conditions of institutional life with a specificity that written records cannot match. Excavations might uncover the foundations of dormitory buildings, showing us their size and layout. We can see how little space each inmate had, sleeping mats arranged in tight rows, with barely enough room to walk between them. We can see evidence of minimal heating, perhaps one fireplace for a room housing 20 people. We can see the lack of windows, the low ceilings, the dirt floors in some cases. Artifact assemblages from poorhouse sites are notably sparse. While excavations of typical Tudor domestic sites yield quantities of pottery, glass, metal objects and other household goods, poorhouse sites produce much less material. What is found tends to be basic and utilitarian: coarse pottery for serving food, a few metal implements for work, occasionally scraps of textile or leather from clothing or shoes. There are no decorative objects, no luxuries, no personal items. The archaeological signature of poverty is like the inventories of the dead, characterized by absence. One excavation in London uncovered what appeared to be a workroom in a poorhouse from the late 16th century. Among the finds were hundreds of fragments of rope, the oakum that inmates had been picking apart. Some fragments still showed the tar coating. Others were reduced to loose fibers. Mingled with the rope fragments were small metal objects, needles, pins, buttons, that had been discovered during the picking process and set aside as having some value. The presence of these artifacts, hundreds of years later, provides tangible evidence of the tedious labor we discussed in segment 1, physical proof of the hours upon hours that paupers spent pulling apart old rope. When archaeologists and historians combine all these different types of evidence, skeletal remains, parish records, personal documents, artifact assemblages, they can begin to reconstruct something of the daily experience of Tudor poverty with surprising detail. We can trace, for instance, the seasonal rhythms of poorhouse life. Admission records show peaks in winter when work was scarce and survival outdoors most difficult. Death records show peaks in spring, after a winter of malnutrition had weakened immune systems, making people vulnerable to the diseases that flourished as the weather warmed. We can see how the institution's population fluctuated, swelling in hard times and shrinking in better times. We can identify different pathways into poverty. Some people fell into destitution suddenly, a craftsman injured and unable to work, a widow left without support, a tenant evicted from their land. Others descended more gradually, a series of setbacks slowly eroding their resources until they had nowhere else to turn. Some entered the poorhouse and left again quickly, using it as temporary shelter during a crisis. Others remained for months or years, aging and dying within its walls. We can even identify networks and relationships among the poor. Parish records sometimes show the same names appearing together repeatedly, perhaps two widows who shared lodgings and looked after each other's children, or a group of laborers who traveled together seeking seasonal work. These glimpses of mutual aid and community among the poor remind us that poverty did not entirely erase human connection, that even in the most difficult circumstances, people formed bonds and tried to help one another. One of the most important things these records preserve is names. The poor were anonymous in life, seen by their social superiors as an undifferentiated mass of unfortunates or idlers, depending on the observer's perspective. But they had names. They were individuals with identities, with histories, with personalities. Reading through parish burial registers, we encounter them one by one. Thomas Miller, pauper; Alice White, widow; John Freeman's child, unnamed; Margaret Shaw, late of the poorhouse. Each name represents a person who lived, who struggled, who experienced hunger and cold and the loneliness of poverty, who perhaps hoped for better and was disappointed, who died and was buried with minimal ceremony in ground that would eventually be forgotten. There is a kind of memorial act in simply reading these names aloud, in acknowledging that these people existed. They left no great monuments, no portraits, no libraries of letters for scholars to study, but they lived. And now, centuries later, archaeologists and historians work to recover their stories from the fragmentary evidence that survives. The excavation of poorhouse cemeteries raises ethical questions that archaeologists must grapple with. These were people who died in poverty and indignity, who were buried without honor in unmarked graves. Is it respectful to disturb their rest now, to examine their bones, to subject their remains to scientific analysis? The archaeological community has increasingly come to view such excavations as an opportunity to give the poor a voice they never had in life. By studying their remains carefully and respectfully, by publishing findings that document their experiences, by creating public exhibitions and educational programs that tell their stories, archaeologists can ensure that these forgotten lives are finally remembered and acknowledged. When remains are excavated, they are treated with respect. Where possible, after analysis is complete, they are reinterred with appropriate ceremony. Memorial markers are sometimes erected acknowledging the people buried in formerly unmarked cemeteries. The work becomes not just scientific investigation, but an act of historical justice, an effort to restore dignity to those who were denied it in their lifetimes. For all that archaeology and archival research can reveal, there is much they cannot tell us. We can know what paupers ate, but not how it tasted to them. We can know they picked oakum until their fingers bled, but not what they thought about during those endless hours of monotonous labor. We can know they were separated from their families, but not the specific grief and longing they felt. We can know they died young, but not their last thoughts, or whether anyone mourned them. The internal experience of poverty, the psychological and emotional reality of life in the poorhouse, must be inferred rather than directly known. We can imagine extrapolating from human nature and from our own experiences of loss and hardship, but we cannot truly know. The poor left traces of their physical existence, but their inner lives, their hopes and fears and dreams, those are largely lost to time. This limitation reminds us to approach these fragmentary sources with humility. We can reconstruct aspects of Tudor poverty with increasing precision, but we should not mistake our reconstructions for the full reality of lived experience. There is always more to any human life than the evidence that survives, and this is especially true for the poor, whose lives were considered unworthy of detailed recording. As we conclude this segment, imagine yourself in an archive or at an excavation site. You are holding a 400-year-old ledger, its pages brown and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. You are reading through lists of names, dates, tiny amounts of money dispensed, or you are looking at a skeleton carefully excavated from the earth, its bones telling stories of malnutrition and hard labor and a life that ended too soon. These are whispers from the past, faint voices of people who were largely voiceless in their own time. They require patient listening, careful interpretation, respectful handling. But they are voices nonetheless, evidence that the poor of Tudor England were not just statistics or social problems, but human beings who lived and suffered and died and deserved to be remembered. The work of recovering their stories continues. New excavations uncover new evidence. New techniques allow us to extract more information from old sources. Gradually, painstakingly, the forgotten lives of the Tudor poor are being brought back into historical consciousness. It is slow work, often frustrating, but it matters. These were real people. They existed. They deserve to be acknowledged. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you might hold in your mind the image of all those names in all those parish registers, all those bones resting in the earth, all those lives lived in hardship and ended in obscurity. They are part of our collective past, part of the human story. In remembering them, we honor their existence and acknowledge our shared humanity across the centuries that separate us.